The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with unspoken tension that seemed to cling to every surface beneath polished wooden benches. The towering judge's bench, the faded American flag drooping in the corner. It was a frigid morning, the kind where the chill seeped through the walls of the old courthouse, mingling with the stale scent of burnt coffee and the musty tang of aged paper. Outside, the world buzzed faintly with the hum of a waking city, but inside these walls, time felt suspended, as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for something to shatter the stillness. Officer Brian Carter stood at the center of it all, his boots rooted to the scuffed floor like they'd been planted there by some unyielding force. His broad shoulders were squared, his chest puffed slightly beneath the crisp lines of his uniform, exuding a confidence that bordered on arrogance. One hand rested casually on the baton at his hip, fingers twitching faintly as if eager for a reason to grip it tighter. The other hovered near his holster, a silent warning that he was always ready to enforce the order he believed he embodied. His eyes, narrowed into slits of suspicion, bore into the man standing near the judge's bench, a figure who seemed to defy every rule Brian had etched into his worldview. "You don't belong here," Brian said, his voice slicing through the quiet like a blade, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't a question, nor an invitation to explain. It was a verdict, delivered with the icy certainty of a man who'd long ago decided he could judge a person by the way they stood, the way they dressed, the color of their skin. His gaze raked over the stranger, a black man in a suit so impeccably tailored, it seemed to mock the faded drabness of the courtroom. The fabric gleamed subtly under the fluorescent lights, the tie knotted with precision, the cufflinks catching the faintest glint. To Brian, it was all wrong, too polished, too confident, too out of place in a world he thought he understood. The man didn't flinch. He stood there, just a few feet from the judge's bench, his posture steady, his presence a quiet anchor amid the storm brewing in Brian's chest. He exhaled slowly, a measured breath that carried no hint of fear, his face a mask of calm that only deepened Brian's irritation. "I said," Brian repeated, his tone hardening, each word dripping with the weight of his authority. "You don't belong here." His lips curled faintly, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth as he waited for the man to cower, to shrink, to obey. But the man didn't move. He adjusted his suit jacket with a subtle tug, the motion deliberate, almost leisurely, as if Brian's words were nothing more than a breeze he could brush aside. "I have every right to be here," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying a quiet strength that seemed to reverberate through the room. There was no defiance in his tone, no anger, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that made Brian's blood simmer. A scoff erupted from Brian's throat, harsh and mocking. "Oh yeah," he shot back, his smirk widening as he took a step closer, his boots thudding against the floor. "And what exactly gives you that right?" His eyes flickered with something dangerous, a spark of impatience that danced on the edge of rage. He'd seen men like this before here, so he thought, men who dressed up their delusions in fine clothes, who carried themselves with an air of entitlement they hadn't earned. In Brian's mind, the world was simple. There were those who belonged and those who didn't. And this man, with his polished demeanor and unyielding gaze, was trespassing on territory he had no claim to. The pause that followed was suffocating, a charged silence that crackled with unspoken threats. The man straightened his posture, his shoulders rolling back as he met Brian's stare head-on. He didn't answer, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't have to. His presence alone should have been enough, a silent testament to his right to stand where he stood. But to Brian, it was an insult, a challenge to the order he'd spent 15 years enforcing. His grip tightened on the baton, the leather of his glove creaking faintly under the pressure. "Last chance," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Leave, or I'll make you." The room seemed to shrink as the words hung in the air, the tension coiling tighter with every passing second. A handful of onlookers in rumpled suits, court clerks clutching stacks of files, a security guard lingering near the door watched in uneasy silence. Some shifted in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between the two men. Others stared at the floor, pretending the scene wasn't unfolding right in front of them. No one spoke. No one moved to intervene. The air buzzed with the weight of their collective inaction. a mute chorus bearing witness to the storm about to break. The man's expression remained unchanged, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. "You're making a mistake," he said simply, his voice cutting through the silence like a whisper of steel. There was no plea in his words, no desperation, just a quiet warning, laced with a depth Brian couldn't or wouldn't grasp. "A mistake," Brian sneered, his patience snapping like a dry twig underfoot. The arrogance, the audacity. Who did this guy think he was? His mind raced, a torrent of assumptions crashing together. This man didn't belong, couldn't belong, not here, not like this. Before another word could pass between them, before the man could offer an explanation, before anyone could step in to stop the inevitable, Brian acted. His boot lashed out, swift and brutal, catching the man square in the back. The impact sent him sprawling forward, his body crashing to the hardwood floor with a sickening thud that echoed through the room. A collective gasp erupted from the onlookers, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the space. Papers fluttered to the ground like wounded birds. A lawyer's pen clattered against the floor. Someone's phone slipped from their hand and skittered across the tiles. The sound of the fall lingered, jarring and final, a punctuation mark on Brian's unchecked fury. For a long, breathless moment, the room froze. Time itself seemed to stumble, caught in the gravity of what had just happened. Then, slowly, the man moved. He pressed his palms against the floor, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he pushed himself up. Dust clung to the knees of his pristine suit, but he brushed it off with a calm precision that bordered on eerie. He straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, smoothed the wrinkles from his sleeves. No rage, no panic, just a quiet, controlled defiance that radiated from him like a pulse. When he turned to face Brian, his eyes locked onto the officers with an intensity that made the air feel heavier, hotter, smaller. Brian's smirk faltered, a flicker of unease creeping into his expression as he met the man's gaze for the first time. Merrily met it. Something cold and unfamiliar slithered up his spine, a slow, creeping realization that he couldn't name but could feel in the pit of his stomach. The weight of the moment crashed down on him, sudden and unrelenting. As the truth unfurled in the silence, the man he'd just assaulted, the man he'd humiliated, the man he'd kicked to the ground like he was nothing was the judge. A wave of disbelief rippled through the room, a tide of shock that left no one untouched. Someone gasped audibly, a sharp sound that pierced the stillness. A clerk muttered a curse under her breath, her hands trembling as she clutched her files tighter. Lawyers exchanged frantic whispers, their voices a low hum of panic and incredulity. The security guard by the door shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor as if he could unsee what had just happened. Brian's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. His pulse hammered in his throat, a wild, frantic rhythm that drowned out the chaos around him. The Judge Malcolm Wright took a single step forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. He didn't need to speak. His very existence was a statement, a living rebuke to every assumption Brian had clung to. He was a black man, yes, but more than that was the law incarnate, a figure of authority Brian had dared to strike down in front of a room full of witnesses. The courtroom, once a stage for Brian's power, now felt like a cage closing in around him. Every pair of eyes bore into him, a silent jury passing judgment with their stares. In that instant, the balance of power shifted, a seismic jolt that left Brian reeling. He was the one out of place now, the one who didn't belong. The judge stood tall, unshaken, his quiet dignity a mirror that reflected Brian's unraveling. The officer's hands trembled faintly, his baton suddenly feeling like a dead weight at his side. He'd spent years wielding his authority like a weapon, believing it made him untouchable. But now that illusion crumbled, piece by jagged piece. The lesson was stark, undeniable. Justice, when abused, turned on its wielder with a ferocity that spared no one. Brian had mistaken power for righteousness, and in his arrogance, he'd toppled not just a man, but the very system he claimed to uphold. The consequences loomed like a shadow stretching across the room, unseen yet inevitable, their reach unknown but certain. For Judge Malcolm Wright, this was more than a personal affront. It was a testament to the battles he'd fought to stand where he did, a reminder that even in victory, the fight for justice was never truly over, And for Brian, it was the beginning of a reckoning, a slow unraveling of the life he'd built on a foundation of unearned certainty. The room watched, breathless, as the scales tipped, and the true weight of power revealed itself in the silence. The air in the room thickened as if it were pressing down on everyone inside, shrinking the vast courtroom into something suffocatingly small. The man stood there, his voice calm and measured, cutting through the tension like a steady hand slicing through tangled threads. "I work here," he said, his tone even, devoid of any need to prove himself. Brian, however, felt a flicker of triumph spark within him. His lips twisted into a smirk, a predator's grin, as though he'd just cornered prey caught in a clumsy lie. "Oh yeah," he shot back, his voice dripping with mockery. "And what exactly gives you the right to be here?" The man didn't flinch. His posture remained as solid as the oak benches lining the room, his face a mask of unreadable calm. He offered no defense, no flurry of credentials, no sharp retort to justify his presence. He simply existed there, standing tall in a space Brian had already mentally marked as off-limits to him. That quiet, defiantious refusal to grovel or explain lit a fuse deep in Brian's chest. His grip tightened around the baton at his side, the smooth wood cool against his palm. A familiar extension of his authority. "Last warning," he growled, his patience unraveling like a frayed rope. "Move, or I'll move you." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd issued such ultimatums countless times before, each one ending with him on top. The man's response came soft but steady, like the first ripple across a still pond. "You're making a mistake." There was no bravado in his words, no veiled threat or plea for mercy, just a quiet, unshakable certainty that seemed to hang in the air, heavy with foreboding. It was the kind of statement that suggested he'd already glimpsed the end of this story, while Brian was still fumbling through its opening lines. But Brian didn't care. His mind was made up, his judgment cemented, in one fluid, furious motion. He lifted his boot and drove it into the man's back with all the force of his coiled frustration. The man stumbled forward, crashing to the floor with a brutal thud that reverberated off the polished wood and stone walls. Papers fluttered from nearby desks like startled birds, scattering across the ground in a chaotic dance. The silence that followed was shattered by a chorus of gasps. A lawyer near the doorway froze, her folder slipping from her hands to hit the floor with a dull slap. A clerk in the corner muttered a curse under his breath, the word sharp and jagged in the stunned quiet. The weight of Brian's actions sank into the room, slow and deliberate, like a stone plunging into deep, glassy water, sending ripples of unease through every onlooker. Brian towered over the fallen man, his chest heaving with the rush of adrenaline, his blood singing with the thrill of control. He'd done it again, taught another lesson, put another trespasser in his place. The world made sense when he could bend it to his will like this. For a long, suspended moment, the room held its breath. Then the man moved, not with the frantic scramble of someone defeated, but with a deliberate grace that seemed almost rehearsed. He pushed himself up from the cold floor, his hands steady as they brushed the dust from his sleeves. With meticulous care, he straightened his tie, the knot sliding back into place with a precision that spoke of unshaken composure. No panic flashed in his eyes, no rage curled his fists. He didn't even glance at the mess of papers around him. He simply stood, rising to his full height, and turned to face Brian. That was when Brian's smirk faltered, his pulse stuttered, then raced, a frantic drumbeat in his ears. For the first time, he truly looked at the man's face, really saw hymen. The air rushed out of his lungs in a single, jagged breath. His stomach twisted into a knot so tight it threatened to choke him. His mind clawed at the edges of the moment, desperate to rewind, to unmake the last few seconds, to escape the trap he just sprung on himself. But time didn't bend to his will. The man standing before him wasn't some random intruder, some petty criminal who'd wandered into the wrong building. This was Judge Malcolm Wright. The realization hit Brian like a sledgehammer to the chest, splintering his confidence into 1,000 jagged pieces. The room tilted beneath his feet, the walls he'd once commanded now closing in like a cage. He hadn't just assaulted a stranger, it attacked a judge. Not just any judge, but the judge of this very courthouse. A man whose authority stretched far beyond these walls, whose influence could unravel lives with a single word. A black man Brian had dismissed without a second thought, assuming he had no place here. Now, it was Brian who didn't belong. The power he'd clung to just moments ago evaporated, leaving him exposed and raw. Malcolm took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with a sound that echoed like a gavel's strike. Brian instinctively stepped back, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Malcolm's presence. For years, Brian had thrived on making men like Malcolm feel small, forcing them to shrink beneath his gaze, to question their right to exist in spaces he guarded. But now, the tables had turned with a merciless swiftness, and fear cold, unfamiliar, and suffocating cold around his heart. The courtroom was a tomb of silence, the air thick with tension that pressed against every surface, every soul. Time seemed to stretch, each second swelling into something unbearable, as if the universe itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. Every pair of ICE lawyers, clerks, spectators looked onto Brian Carter, the officer who'd once strode through these halls with unshakable certainty. Now, he stood frozen, his hands still clenched at his sides, his body rigid with a shock he couldn't shake. Judge Malcolm Wright said nothing more, not yet. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, the fabric pristine despite the fall, and faced Brian with a composure that never wavered. No flicker of anger crossed his features, no hint of fear or vengeance, just control pure, unrelenting control that terrified Brian more than any shout or fist ever could. He'd braced himself for a fight, for the chaos he knew how to handle. He'd spent years crushing defiance, silencing resistance with the weight of his badge and baton. But this silence was a weapon he didn't understand, a force that left no cracks for him to exploit, no openings for him to regain his footing. Then Malcolm spoke, his voice slicing through the stillness like a blade honed to perfection. "You," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with purpose, just assaulted a judge inside his own courtroom. The words landed like blows, sinking deep into Brian's bones. His breath caught, his heartbeat a deafening roar that drowned out the murmurs rippling through the room. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to claw his way back to solid ground. But no sound came. Malcolm took another step forward, the sound of his shoe against the floor a thunderclap in the quiet. "Tell me, Officer Carter," he continued, tilting his head just enough to make Brian's insides churn. "What exactly do you think happens next?" Brian's throat was a dessert, his tongue useless. His instinct screamed at him to act or say something, anything, to wrest control back before it slipped away entirely. He'd faced down challenges before, stared into the eyes of people who dared to question him, and always come out on top. But this was different. This was a certainty he couldn't outrun, a reckoning he couldn't dodge. Before he could muster a response, another voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "What the hell is going on here?" Brian's head snapped toward the sound, his pulse spiking as Captain James Holloway stormed into the room. The captain's strides were quick and forceful, his broad shoulders squared, his face a mask of barely contained fury. His eyes darted between Malcolm and Brian, narrowing as they settled on his subordinate with a look of pure disbelief. Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Your officer physically assaulted me in my own courtroom," he said, his voice a blade slicing through the lingering haze of shock, in front of multiple witnesses. Brian's body went stiff, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Captain Holloway's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Is that true?" Brian's jaw clenched. This was his last shot, his final chance to turn the tide. He refused to identify himself, he said, forcing authority back into his tone. Though it trembled at the edges, "I gave multiple warnings." He wouldn't comply. Malcolm's lips twitched just a flicker, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace, but a sign of unshaken certainty. "That's interesting," he replied, his voice smooth and steady, "because I distinctly remember telling you I had every right to be here." He paused, letting the words settle like stones in Brian's gut. "But you weren't interested in listening to facts, were you, Officer Carter?" The courtroom was a void, silent and suffocating. Brian's fists tightened at his sides, nails digging into his palms. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "Justice," he'd always believed, was his to wield a tool to enforce order, to punish those who stepped out of line. But now, he saw it for what it could truly be, a mirror reflecting the consequences of his own arrogance, a force that didn't bend to his will. Malcolm stood as its embodiment, a man whose quiet strength exposed the fragility of Brian's power. The lesson was clear, etched into the silence of that room-abyss authority, and it will turn on you. Relentless and unforgiving. The world, as Captain Holloway knew it, had rules unspoken. But ironcladen, this wasn't how it was supposed to unravel. His breath came out in a jagged huff, the kind that carried the weight of exasperation and disbelief, as he dragged a calloused hand down his face, fingers scraping against the stubble he hadn't had time to shave. Then his gaze locked onto Brian Carter, a piercing stare so intense it seemed to slice through the haze of the precinct, like a blade through flesh. "Christ, Brian," Holloway muttered, his voice a gravelly murmur steeped in something raucous. "Maybe, or the bitter edge of disappointment. Do you even comprehend the mess you've just made?" Brian's jaw clenched tight, his teeth grinding together as a wildfire of shame and defiance roared through him. His skin prickled under the heat of a dozen pairs of eyes boring into him, stripping him bare in the sterile glow of the precinct's flickering fluorescent lights. He could feel every bead of sweat forming on his brow, every pulse hammering in his veins. "Captain, this is," he started, his voice trembling with the desperation of a man grasping at straws. But Holloway cut him off with a sharp snap of words, stepping closer until the space between them crackled with tension. "It's not up for debate," he hissed, his tone dropping to a furious whisper that felt like a slap. "You assaulted a sitting judge, Brian, in broad daylight, on camera, with witnesses everywhere. What in God's name do you expect me to do with that?" Brian's stomach churned violently, a nauseating twist that made his knees weak. His badge, his gun, his entire career, they hung in the balance, fragile as glass teetering on the edge of a table. Holloway's face hardened into an unyielding mask, his hand outstretched like a guillotine waiting to fall. "Hand them over. Now." The command was cold, final. Brian's breath hitched, a sharp gasp that echoed in his ears alongside a high-pitched ringing, as if his mind refused to accept the reality crashing down around him. His fingers shook uncontrollably as they fumbled toward his badge, the metal gleaming dully under the harsh light. It felt heavier than it ever had, a leaden weight that pressed against his chest like a death knell. He placed it in Holloway's palm, the soft clink of it landing sounding like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. Then came the gun, its cold steel slipping from his grasp like the last tether to the man he'd been moments ago, a man with authority, with purpose. Now his hands were empty, and the shift in the room was palpable, a seismic rupture he couldn't ignore. The officers who'd flanked him earlier, their presence once a quiet reassurance, now stood like statues, their faces unreadable masks of distance. The lawyers, the clerks, the court staff, they all watched, a silent jury bearing witness to the collapse of his world. Their eyes carried judgment, pity, and something worse, indifference. And then, as if the universe conspired to twist the knife deeper, Brian's gaze snagged on the reporters lurking at the courtroom's edge. Cameras flashed like predatory eyes, microphones thrust forward like spears. Of course they were here. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a spectacle, a scandal that would blaze across headlines and bury him alive. His heart thudded painfully, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, as the enormity of it sank in. Malcolm Wright, the judge he'd wronged, let out a soft, deliberate exhale, shaking his head onto a gesture so understated, yet so loaded with meaning it made Brian's skin crawl. Malcolm moved past him, his steps slow and measured, each one a quiet declaration of inevitability. At the door, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder for a fleeting second. "I warned you," he said, his voice low, calm, and utterly devastating, like the tolling of a bell signaling the end. Then he was gone, leaving Brian alone with the wreckage, his fists curled tight, nails biting into his palms as his mind raced, scrambling for a life-lonesome excuse, some miracle to stop the avalanche bearing down on him. But deep down he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The precinct smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, a sharp, clinging odor that seemed to seep into the walls, a permanent mark of too many long nights and broken promises. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their faint flicker sensing with the pounding in Brian's chest, amplifying the suffocating pressure that pinned him to the worn plastic chair in the waiting area. It was quieter than usual, the emptiness stretching out like a void. Yet it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. He sat hunched forward, elbows digging into his knees, fingers locked together so tightly his knuckles blanched white. He hadn't spoken much since surrendering his badge and gun, since Malcolm had walked out of that courtroom with the grace of a man who knew he held all the cards. Holloway stood before him, arms crossed, his eyes boring into Brian like a prosecutor sizing up a guilty man clinging to denial. Finally, Holloway broke the silence with a long, weary sigh, rubbing a hand over his face as if he could scrub away the exhaustion. "Do you have any idea what kind of hellstorm you've just unleashed?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of a man who'd seen too many good officers fall. Brian lifted his head, his jaw tight, his mind a chaotic whirl of panic and defiance. "I didn't know who he was," he said, the words spilling out in a rush, feeble even to his own ears. Holloway's response was a sharp bark of disbelief, laced with a thread of incredulity that stung. "And that's supposed to fix it? Jesus, Brian, you didn't stop for one damn second to think before you laid hands on him before you kicked him to the ground like he was some street punk." He pressed his fingers to his temple, wincing as if the situation physically pained him, a headache born of Brian's recklessness. Brian straightened, forcing a steadiness into his voice he didn't feel. "I was following protocol." He was in a restricted area. He wouldn't comply. The words sounded hollow, a flimsy shield against the truth. Holloway's laugh was short, bitter, devoid of humor. "You think that's going to hold water? The man you attacked is Judge Malcolm Rightone, of the most respected figures in this city. He's been on the bench for decades, Brian. He's got allies who'd crush you under their heels without a second thought." The words landed like blows, each one tightening the knot in Brian's throat. He'd known Malcolm had power, but this was a tidal wave he hadn't seen coming. Before he could muster a response, the heavy metal door to the interrogation room creaked open, the sound slicing through the tension like a knife. "Let's not drag this out any longer," a voice cut in, smooth and commanding. "We all know why we're here." Malcolm Wright stepped inside, his presence shifting the air in an instant. His suit was pristine, every crease sharp, his expression a blank slate that betrayed nothing. He didn't look at Brian immediately. Instead, he took his time crossing the room, unbuttoning his jacket with deliberate care before settling into the chair across from him. Every move was calculated, a silent assertion of control. Holloway cleared his throat, glancing between the two men, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Judge Wright," he began, but Malcolm raised a hand, his voice calm yet edged with steel. "Leave us." Holloway hesitated, his gaze darting to Brianna, a warning, a plea, maybe both. With all due respect, he tried again, but Malcolm's eyes met his, steady and unyielding. "I won't ask twice." The captain's shoulders slumped as he exhaled sharply, casting one last look at Brian before retreating. "I'll be right outside," he muttered, the door thudding shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating, a vacuum that swallowed every sound but the hammering of Brian's pulse. He forced himself to meet Malcolm's gaze, finding the judge studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Malcolm's fingers laced together on the table, his posture relaxed yet coiled, like a predator biding its time. "How long have you been a cop, Officer Carter?" The question caught Brian off guard, throwing him into a tailspin. 15 years, he answered, his voice rough, unsteady. Malcolm nodded slowly, as if tucking the detail away for later use. 15 years, he echoed, letting the words hang in the air. "That's a long time to learn the ropes, to figure out how people work. Tell me, in all those years, have you ever misjudged someone?" Brian's fists clenched beneath the table, his nails digging into his palms. "I do my job," he said, dodging the question, but Malcolm wasn't having it. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he dissected Brian with surgical precision. "That's not what I asked. You were so certain about me, weren't you? You didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. You saw me, and in that split second, you'd already written my story. Trespasser, threat, someone who didn't belong. Brian's stomach twisted. A sickening lurch as Malcolm's words hit too close to home. You were in a restricted area. He shot back, clinging to the excuse like a lifeline. Malcolm's lips twitched, a flicker of something dark amusement, perhaps dancing in his eyes. That's what you're sticking with, that I was somewhere I shouldn't have been. Leaning back slightly, Malcolm exhaled, the sound slow and deliberate, a prelude to the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Tell me, Officer Carter, when you grabbed me, when you slammed me to the ground in front of that courtroom full of people, what did you think would happen next? Did you imagine I'd just lie there, silent and broken? Did you think no one would care enough to notice? Or did you think he paused, letting the silence stretch taut between them, a wire ready to snap? Did you think I wouldn't matter enough for it to cost you? Brian's fingers twitched, his throat dry as sandpaper. You can answer honestly, Malcolm pressed, his voice steady, unyielding. I already know the truth. I just want to hear you say it. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as Brian's world unraveled thread by thread. His entire career had been built on instinct, on the unshakable belief that he could read a situation, a person, in an instant. He'd thrived on control, on never being questioned, never having to explain himself. But now, under Malcolm's unrelenting gaze, he felt like a specimen pinned to a board, every flaw exposed. Malcolm nodded faintly, as if confirming something to himself. You know, I've spent my life dealing with men like you who stride into a room and decide who's worthy, and who isn't before a word is spoken. Men who let their gut he spat the word like it was poison tell them everything they need to know. The lesson here wasn't just about Brian's fall. It was about justice, about the consequences of wielding power without thought. Malcolm, with his quiet authority and unshakable presence, embodied the system Brian had underestimated, a system that didn't bend for reckless men, no matter how righteous they believed themselves to be. And as Brian sat there, stripped of his badge, his gun, his pride, he began to understand. Power abused doesn't just destroy its target. It turns back on the one who swings the fist, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as Brian Carter sat hunched over the table, his pulse hammering so fiercely in his ears that it drowned out the faint buzz of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. His chest heaved with every breath, each one sharp and ragged, as if his lungs were fighting to keep up with the chaos spiraling inside him. Sweat beaded along his brow, trickling down the side of his face, but he didn't wipe it away as hands lay limp on the cold metal table, trembling faintly, useless. Across from him stood Malcolm Wright, his presence looming like a shadow that stretched far beyond the confines of the small, sterile interrogation room. Malcolm's lips curved into a smile, but it wasn't warm or forgiving. It was a blade, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the tension with chilling ease. So, Officer Carter, Malcolm began, his voice smooth and low, tinged with a quiet amusement that made Brian's stomach twist into knots. Are you sitting there expecting me to lecture you, to wag my finger like some disappointed schoolteacher? Or do you think I'm here because I still want something from you? He paused, letting the words settle, his dark eyes glinting with a knowing that made Brian's skin crawl. Let me put that question to rest. I've already gotten everything I came for. Brian's throat tightened, his mouth suddenly so dry he could barely swallow. The weight of Malcolm's words pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting, like a stone sinking deeper into his chest with every passing second. Do you honestly believe, Malcolm continued, his tone dropping even lower, almost conspiratorial, that you still have a career waiting for you after this? That your precious union will swoop in to shield you? That the department, your so-called brothers in blue, will take this fall on your behalf? Do you think anyone in that courthouse will ever scrub what they saw from their minds? Brian's heart thudded harder, a frantic rhythm that echoed in his skull. He wanted to look away, to escape the piercing intensity of Malcolm's gaze, but he couldn't. Those eyes held him captive, stripping away every layer of bravado he'd ever worn. Malcolm's voice remained steady, measured, a calm that felt more dangerous than any shout. They're going to turn you into a lesson, Brian. The department needs a scapegoat, a sacrificial lamb to parade before the public, and you're perfect for it. He leaned in slightly, just enough to make the air between them feel suffocating. Do you know why? The question lingered, suspended in the silence, like a guillotine waiting to drop. Ryan's breath hitched, his mind racing for an answer, a defense, anything, but nothing came. Malcolm let the moment stretch, savoring it, before he spoke again. "Because I'm not the first person you've done this to. I'm not the first soul you've crushed under that badge, am I? But here's the difference: I'm the first one with the power to sign your entire existence away. With a single stroke of a pen." Ryan's mouth felt like it was lined with sand, his tongue heavy and useless. Malcolm shifted forward, resting his elbows on the table with a casual grace that only deepened Brian's unease. And the best part, Malcolm's voice dropped to a whisper, soft and venomous, curling around Brian like smoke. "I don't even have to lift a finger. You've already ruined yourself." The truth hit Brian like a punch to the gut, stealing what little air he had left. His breaths came in jagged, uneven gasps, his chest tightening as the reality of his situation clawed its way deeper into his consciousness. He wanted to scream, to argue, to hurl something back at Malcolm, anything to shatter the suffocating certainty that pinned him to that chair, but the words wouldn't come. The truth sat there between them, a towering, unyielding monument to his mistakes, indelible, unshakable, inescapable. This wasn't just the end of his career, his livelihood, or the life he'd built brick by brick. This was the end of him. Malcolm exhaled softly, a sound that carried a strange finality, and rose to his feet with the same effortless precision he'd carried all along. He buttoned his jacket, each movement smooth and deliberate, as if he were preparing to step into a world that still bent to his will. He cast one last glance down at Brian, his expression a mask, unreadable, impenetrable, cold. "Good luck, Officer Carter," he said, his voice cool and clipped, the words dripping with a quiet menace. Then, without another word, he turned, the door swinging open with a faint creak. Malcolm stepped through, his silhouette swallowed by the light beyond, and the door clicked shut behind him. Ryan was alone. The silence crashed over him like a wave, thick and suffocating, broken only by the dull hum of the lights and the erratic pounding of his own heart. He sat frozen, his body rigid in the chair, the cold seeping into his bones from the lifeless room around him. His badge was gone, stripped away along with his gun, his authority, his identity, everything that had once defined him reduced to ash in the wake of Malcolm's departure. The echoes of those final words lingered in the air, clinging to him like a stain he couldn't scrub clean. The door creaked open again, jolting Brian from his stupor. His head snapped up, eyes wide and wild, as Captain Holloway stepped inside. The older man's face was a storm of barely contained fury, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with a heat that made Brian's stomach churn. Holloway shut the door with a heavy thud that reverberated through the room, exhaling sharply through his nose as he crossed his arms over his chest. "Do you have any goddamn idea how bad this is?" His voice was low, sharp as a blade, carrying a weight that made it clear this wasn't a discussion, it was a judgment. Ryan's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together as he fought to hold on to some shred of composure. He knew. He'd known the moment Malcolm had walked out of that room with his head held high, the world still firmly in his grasp. "The videos everywhere," Holloway went on, his tone laced with a bitter edge, teetering between disbelief and rage. "The whole damn city's seen it. Hell, the whole country by now. Do you even understand what that means?" Ryan's gut twisted tighter, a nauseating coil of dread and shame. He'd never feared losing control before control had been his weapon, his shield, the thing that kept him steady no matter the chaos. But now it was slipping through his fingers, faster than he could claw it back. "They're throwing you to the wolves, Carter," Holloway said, his voice rising slightly, the frustration boiling over. "The department can't save you from this. No one can. You're not just some cop who made a mistake. You're the poster boy for a national scandal." The words landed like blows, each one driving the air from Brian's lungs. His stomach lurched, and he forced himself to speak, his voice rough and desperate, scraping against the raw edges of his throat. "I can fix this." It was a plea, a last-ditch grasp at hope, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow, brittle. Holloway's response was a bitter, barking laugh, sharp and devoid of humor. He shook his head, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Brian with something close to pity. "Fix it? Jesus Christ, Brian, listen to yourself. You don't fix something like this. This isn't a slap on the wrist for a bad arrest or a minor excessive force complaint. You assaulted a judge in front of witnesses, on camera, for the world to see. Tell me, what part of that do you think you can fix? Brian swallowed hard, the lump in his throat nearly choking him. His fingers twitched again, restless against the table, but they felt foreign, detached, like they belonged to someone else. I didn't know who he was, he muttered, the excuse tumbling out before he could stop it. The words sounded weak, pathetic, even to his own ears, dissolving into the air the moment they left his lips. Holloway's nostrils flared, his face darkening with a fury that made Brian shrink back instinctively. And that's supposed to make it better, the captain snapped, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. That's supposed to justify what you did. Tell me something, Brian, if he hadn't been a judge, if he'd just been another black man standing in that courtroom, would you have hesitated? Would you have done a damn thing differently? The question slammed into Brian like a freight train, knocking the breath from his chest. His mouth opened, lips parting to respond, but no sound came. His mind scrambled for a defense, a lie, anything, but there was nothing. Holloway shook his head again, disgust flashing across his weathered features. That's what I thought, he muttered, the words heavy with resignation. A thick, suffocating silence stretched between them, the weight of it pressing down on Brian until he felt like he might collapse under it. His hands curled into fists, nails digging into his palms hard enough to draw blood. But the pain was distant, drowned out by the storm raging inside him. He wanted to fight back, to shout, to demand a way out, but deep down, he knew there was no escaping this. The door swung open once more, and Brian's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaping him as Malcolm Wright stepped back into the room. Malcolm's presence filled the space instantly, deliberate and unshakable. The same quiet power radiating from him as it had from the start of this nightmare. Only now, it felt heavier, more oppressive, bearing down on Brian with an intensity he couldn't withstand. Malcolm said nothing at first, his gaze sweeping the room slowly, taking in every detail before settling on Brian, cold, unreadable, piercing. Then he turned to Holloway, his voice steady and even. I need a moment alone with him. Holloway hesitated, his eyes flicking to Brian. For a fleeting second, something softened in the captain's expression, pity, perhaps, or regret, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He exhaled sharply, gave a curt nod, and turned on his heel, stepping out without a word. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing Brian and Malcolm in the room together once more. Brian sucked in a shaky breath, forcing himself to sit up straighter, to cling to some semblance of control, but it was a flimsy facade, crumbling with every second that passed. Malcolm didn't rush. He moved with a maddening calm, lowering himself into the chair across from Brian with that same calculated grace, his hands clasping together on the table as if this were a casual meeting rather than a reckoning. You know, Malcolm said at last, his voice soft but laced with a quiet danger. I've been thinking a lot about that moment in the courtroom, about what was running through your mind. What made you so certain you were in the right? Brian exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening until it ached. I thought I was doing my job, he said, the words clipped and defensive, though they felt flimsy even as he spoke them. Malcolm nodded slowly, as if weighing the response. Your job, he repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air. And what exactly do you think that job is? Brian's fingers twitched again, a nervous tick he couldn't suppress. To keep people safe, he said, his voice quieter now, less sure. Malcolm let out a faint breath, almost a laugh. But there was no trace of amusement in it, only a cold, cutting edge. Safe, he echoed, tilting his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Brian's. Tell me, Officer Carterwell, were you keeping safe when you put your hands on me? When you kicked me to the floor without a second thought, without even a question? Who was the danger in that room? Because from where I was sprawled out on that cold tile, tasting blood in my mouth, only person abusing power was you. Brian's pulse roared in his ears, a deafening thunder that drowned out everything else. Malcolm leaned forward just a fraction, his voice dropping lower, slicing through the noise. I don't think you've ever asked yourself that question before today. I don't think you've ever had to. Brian swallowed, his fists clenching tighter. the sting of his nails grounding him even as his world spun out of control. Malcolm wasn't done. You had power, he continued, his tone smooth and unrelenting. You had control, and you thought that made you untouchable. You thought it gave you the right to act first and figure out the consequences later. And maybe you were right. Tunnel now. Brian's breaths came in short, uneven bursts, his chest tight with a panic he couldn't name. You see, Officer Carter, Malcolm said, his voice like silk over steel, this time. You picked the wrong man this time. You chose someone who can fight back. And for the first time in your life, you're going to feel what it's like to be on the other side of that power. The words sank into Brian like lead, heavy and cold, dragging him down into a pit he couldn't climb out of. Malcolm's gaze didn't waver, steady and unflinching, a mirror reflecting every mistake, every arrogance, every abuse Brian had ever wielded. There are consequences for men like you, Malcolm said softly, almost mournfully. Not often, not nearly enough, but this time there will be. Brian's mouth was dry as ash, his throat burning as he forced himself to meet Malcolm's eyes, to hold on to whatever scraps of pride he had left. So what? He rasped, the words barely audible, a desperate grasp at defiance. But Malcolm cut him off, not with words, but with a look that said everything Brian feared most. This wasn't just about justice, it was about the cost of power, the reckoning that came when it was wielded without thought, without care. And as Malcolm rose once more, leaving Brian alone in the wreckage of his own making, the lesson burned into the silence. Power unchecked was a blade that cut both ways, and Brian had finally felt its edge. The air in the interrogation room hung heavy, thick with a tension that seemed to seep into every corner, wrapping itself around Brian Carter like a shroud. He sat motionless, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, as though the weight of the world had settled squarely upon them. His hands rested on the cold metal table, fingers interlocked so tightly that the skin across his knuckles stretched white, a silent testament to the storm raging within him. His throat felt like sandpaper, dry and constricted, each swallow a painful reminder of the words he couldn't take back, the actions he couldn't undo. The flickering fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting jagged shadows across the stark gray walls, a relentless hum that mirrored the chaos in his mind. For years, Brian had walked through life with an unshakable confidence, his badge a shield, his authority a sword. Now, stripped of both, he sat powerless, a man unmoored, watching the life he'd built crumble in slow, agonizing motion. Malcolm Wright stood across from him, his presence commanding despite the simplicity of his movements. He exhaled slowly, a measured breath that carried a weight of its own, his lips twitching faintly, not in amusement, but in something more complex, something Brian couldn't quite name. Officer Carter, Malcolm began, his voice steady yet tinged with a quiet gravity. Your life isn't over, but the life you imagined for yourself, one where you called the shots, where you stood above the rest, that's gone. He shook his head, a subtle gesture that felt like a gavel striking wood. Final and unyielding, Brian's chest tightened, a sharp pang slicing through him as Malcolm straightened, his fingers deftly buttoning his tailored jacket. For a fleeting moment, just a heartbeat, Brian caught a glimpse of something in Malcolm's dark eyes. It wasn't the smug satisfaction he'd expected, nor the cold fury he'd braced himself for. It was deeper, subterfuge, perhaps, or a weary understanding, and somehow, that cut deeper than any condemnation could have. Malcolm turned toward the door, his polished shoes tapping softly against the concrete floor. He paused, one hand resting on the handle, and glanced back over his shoulder. His voice dropped, softer now, almost reflective. Enjoy your new reality, Officer Carter. I hope it teaches you something. Then, with a faint click of the latch, he was gone, leaving Brian alone in the suffocating silence. The walls seemed to creep closer, the room shrinking around him as the enormity of his situation pressed in. His heart pounded in his ears, a relentless drumbeat underscoring the unraveling of everything he'd known. For the first time in his 38 years, Brian Carter, a man who'd thrived on control, who'd bent the world to his will, had no power to stop the collapse. The interrogation room was a prison of its own making, its confines far more oppressive than its modest dimensions suggested. The air was stale, thick with the metallic tang of fear and regret, and the harsh light above flickered erratically, as if mocking his fractured state. Brian's mind spun, a whirlwind of memories and justifications clashing against the stark reality before him. He'd spent years striding into rooms with his head held high, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming, a symbol of order, of righteousness. He'd been untouchable, or so he'd believed. Every decision, every command had felt justified, bolstered by the weight of his authority. But now, that authority was ash, scattered by a single, catastrophic misstep. Was it truly a mistake? The question gnawed at him, burrowing into his chest like a splinter. When he'd acted, when he'd raised his fist in that courtroom, when he'd let instinct override reason, it hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt right, instinctive, the way he'd handled countless situations before. Only this time, the consequences had come crashing down, unyielding and merciless. The heavy groan of the metal door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. His head snapped up, pulse racing, only to sink into dread as Captain Holloway stepped inside. The older man moved with a deliberate slowness, his weathered face a mask of neutrality at first glance. But Brian knew him to well. 20 years under Holloway's command had taught him to read the subtle signs, the rigid set of his shoulders, the faint clench of his jaw, the shadowed weight in his gray eyes. Holloway shut the door with a resounding thud, the sound reverberating through the room like a judge's verdict. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, his stance unyielding. You have any idea how bad this is? Carter, his voice was low, edged with a sharpness that cut through the haze of Brian's denial. Brian swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. Of course he knew. He'd known the moment his fist connected, the moment the courtroom erupted, the moment the cameras caught it all. Holloway dragged a hand down his face, his exhale heavy with exhaustion. The videos everywhere, every news channel, every website, every damn corner of the internet. You're viral, Carter. Brian's stomach lurched, a wave of nausea crashing over him. He hadn't even considered the footage, hadn't thought beyond the chaos of the moment. Holloway's voice grew tighter, laced with a bitter mix of frustration and resignation. You know what that means? It means the department's done with you. They're throwing you to the wolves, cutting ties faster than you can blink. They don't have a choice. Brian's jaw clenched, defiance flaring briefly in his chest. They can't just. Holloway's laugh cut him off, a harsh, humorless bark. Oh, they can. And they are. You think they're gonna stand by you after this? You're not some rookie who botched a traffic stop. You're the idiot who assaulted a sitting judge in front of a packed courtroom, and it's all on tape. There's no coming back from that. Brian's pulse roared, his breaths coming in ragged bursts. I didn't know who he was, he bit out, the words tasting like ash. Holloway's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. And that's supposed to make it okay? Brian's teeth ground together, his voice rising despite himself. I thought I was doing my job. Holloway shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion that carried the weight of disappointment. No, Carter. You thought you were above your job. You thought your gut was enough, that you didn't need to question yourself, that your judgment was the law. And now you're sitting here on the wrong side of that table. And nobody gives a damn about your gut anymore. The words landed like blows, each one sinking deeper, twisting the knife of truth in Brian's core. He hated the way Holloway stared at him, hated the pity mingled with scorn in his captain's gaze. Holloway stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, sharp and probing. Tell me something, Brian. If he hadn't been a judge, he'd just been another black man standing there in that courtroom. Would you have done anything different? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Brian's throat seized, his mind scrambling for a defense, an excuse, anything to push back against the accusation. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, he knew the answer, and so did Holloway. The captain's eyes bore into him, unrelenting, until he finally let out a slow, weary breath. That's what I thought. The silence that followed was a chasm, vast and unbridgeable. Holloway straightened, his voice softening but no less cutting. You always thought this job made you untouchable, but there's a line. Carter, a line you never thought you'd cross. Guess what? You did. Brian's breath shuddered out of him, his head throbbing with the weight of it all. I can fix this, he said, the words trembling with desperation. Holloway's response was immediate, final. "No, Brian, you can't." The certainty in his tone settled into Brian's bones, a cold, immovable truth. No way out, no second chance, no department to shield him. Just consequence raw, unfiltered, and deserved. The door creaked open again, and Brian's heart lurched as Malcolm Wright re-entered the room. He moved with an effortless grace, his tailored suit pristine, his demeanor calm yet commanding. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood there, his gaze sweeping over Brian with a quiet intensity that made the younger man's stomach twist. Malcolm adjusted the cuffs of his jacket with deliberate care, each motion precise, before finally lowering himself into the chair across the table. He folded his hands together, exhaling softly, and when he spoke, his voice was low but resonant. "You know, Officer Carter, I've spent a long time thinking about men like you who walk into a room and decide someone's fate before a word is spoken. You call it instinct, experience. But it's not, it's power, raw, unchecked power." Brian's jaw locked, a flicker of defiance sparking in his chest. "I did what I thought was right," he said, his voice tight. Malcolm's lips curved into a faint smile, but it held no warmth, only a quiet sadness. "And that's the problem. You've never paused to ask if your right aligns with justice. You've leaned on that badge like it's a crown, using it to judge, to control, to decide who's worthy and who's not. But now, here you were just another man, stripped bare, begging for mercy from the very system you thought you owned." Brian's pulse thundered, anger flaring hot and sharp, but he forced it down, his hands trembling against the table. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "So what now? You think I'm here to ruin you? To make an example of you?" He paused, letting the question linger, then shook his head. "No, Brian, you've already done that yourself." The words struck like a thunderclap, reverberating through Brian's core. Malcolm rose, buttoning his jacket with the same smooth precision, and stared down at him for a long, unbroken moment. "Justice isn't about revenge," he said quietly. "It's about accountability. You abused your power, and now you face the consequences. Learn from it if you can." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Brian alone once more. The echo of his words a haunting reminder of the lesson carved into this moment. Power without restraint is a fragile illusion, and justice, when it comes, spares no one. The air in the interrogation room hung heavy, a suffocating shroud that clung to Brian like damp fog on a winter morning. His hands, clenched into fists so tight his nails bit into the flesh of his palms, trembled faintly against the chipped metal table. Each breath he took was a deliberate effort, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that did little to calm the tempest roaring within him. Beneath his skin, his pulse thunder-eaten, erratic drumbeat echoing the chaos of a life spiraling beyond his grasp. The world he'd once commanded, a kingdom built on unwavering authority and unshakable certainty, was disintegrating before his eyes, piece by jagged piece. For the first time, he felt the weight of powerlessness settle over him like an iron cloak, its cold embrace inescapable. The door creaked open, a slow groan that sliced through the silence, and Brian's head jerked up, his breath snagging in his throat. His lawyer stepped inside, a figure carved from precision of his suit pressed to perfection, briefcase gripped tightly in one hand. The man's face was a mask, devoid of warmth or reassurance, his eyes flat as he crossed the room, without so much as a glance in Brian's direction. He moved with the measured grace of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, settling into the chair opposite Brian and placing his briefcase on the table with a soft thud. A long, weary exhale escaped him, as though the weight of what lay ahead had already drained the life from his bones. Brian's throat tightened, his voice scraping out like gravel. "Tell me you've got something," he said, the words tinged with a desperation he couldn't mask. The lawyer's gaze lifted, meeting Brian's with an expression so unreadable it sent a chill racing down his spine. His fingers tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm against the briefcase's metal clasp. "Define something," he replied, his tone as dry as dust. Brian's chest constricted, a vice tightening around his ribs. "Something that gets me out of this," he pressed, his voice rising. "Something that fixes it." The lawyer sighed again, a sound heavy with resignation. and shook his head just enough to make Brian's stomach lurch. "There's no fixing this, Brian," he said, his words landing like stones in still water. He unlatched the briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of documents, their edges crisp and orderly, a stark contrast to the chaos they represented. "I spoke to the DA. They're moving forward with assault on a public official. That charge alone could mean 5 years. And this isn't just any case, it's high profile. The public's watching. The department's under pressure to make an example of you. No jury's going to let you walk away unscathed." Brian's breath came in shallow bursts, his vision swimming as the room seemed to tilt. "So what are my options?" he managed, his voice fraying at the edges. The lawyer flipped through the pages, his fingers pausing briefly before he looked up, his eyes steady but devoid of hope. "You plead guilty to aggravated assault. They'll reduce the sentence to 2 years minimum, maybe less if we can push for probation. But don't hold your breath. 2 years. The words hit Brian like a physical blow, his mind reeling as the reality sank in. "You think I'm just going to sit here and take that?" he snapped, his voice raw with defiance, desperation clawing at his throat. The lawyer's lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. "You don't have a choice, Brian." Fury surged through him, and Brian slammed his fist against the table, the sharp crack reverberating through the room like a gunshot. "Like hell I don't," he roared. The lawyer didn't flinch, his composure unshaken. "Then go to trial," he said coolly. "Let them tear you apart. They'll play that video on repeat, one of you losing contraluntal. Even you start to believe you're the monster they're painting you as. Malcolm Wright will take the stand, look every juror in the eye, and make damn sure they see you for what you've become. The judge, he's itching to bury you, Brian. And you handed him the tools to do it." The words cut deep, each one a blade twisting in Brian's gut. He leaned back in his chair, his breath trembling, his mind racing to find a foothold in the crumbling ruins of his life. He'd always been the one holding the gavel, the one who decided who faced justice and who slipped through the cracks. Now he was the one staring down the barrel of judgment, and the irony was a bitter poison burning through his veins. The lawyer leaned back, folding his hands over the documents, letting the silence stretch like a taut wire. Brian's throat closed, his voice barely a whisper. 2 years, the lawyer nodded, his expression softening just enough to hint at pity. "It's the best you're going to get. Take it, Brian. If this goes to trial, it'll be worse, I promise you that." Brian exhaled, a shaky breath that did nothing to steady the tremor in his hands. The door swung open again, and before he could brace himself, Captain Holloway stepped inside. The man's broad frame filled the doorway, his uniform crisp, his face a stone wall etched with lines of duty and disappointment. His eyes met Brian's, unreadable yet heavy with something final, a weight that pressed down on the room like a storm cloud rolling in. He stepped forward, his boots thudding softly against the concrete floor. "You have a visitor," he said, his voice low and steady, though a flicker of hesitation crossed his features as he glanced toward the door. Brian's brows furrowed, confusion cutting through the fog of his despair. "Who?" Holloway paused, just for a heartbeat, before Malcolm Wright stepped into the room. The temperature seemed to plummet, the walls shrinking inward as Malcolm's presence filled the space. His movements were deliberate, each step a quiet assertion of control, his tailored coat swaying slightly as he crossed the threshold. He didn't sit, not yet. He stood there, towering over the table, his gaze locked on Brian with an intensity that felt like a physical force. Holloway exchanged a brief, wordless glance with the lawyer, then gave a curt nod. "Give them a minute," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The lawyer hesitated, his fingers lingering on the briefcase before he gathered his papers with a quiet rustle, snapped the case shut, and followed Holloway out. The door closed with a hollow thud, sealing Brian and Malcolm in a silence so thick it seemed to hum. Brian forced himself to meet Malcolm's eyes, his pulse pounding in his throat like a trapped animal clawing to escape. "What the hell do you want?" he rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion and dread. Malcolm exhaled slowly, a sound that carried the weight of years, and lowered himself into the chair across from Brian. He studied him for a long moment, his expression calm to calm, like the still surface of a lake hiding a current strong enough to drown. "I wanted to see you one last time," he said finally, his voice smooth and measured, each word deliberate. Brian's stomach twisted into knots. "What for?" he demanded, his fists tightening until his knuckles ached. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Because I wanted to look you in the eye when you realize you're not walking away from this. Not this time." The words landed like a punch, stealing the air from Brian's lungs. "You here to gloat?" He spat, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. Malcolm's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, not quite a frown, a shadow of something unreadable. "You think this is about revenge?" He shook his head, a faint, almost pitying gesture. "No, Brian. This is about you finally facing what you are." Brian's pulse spiked, his chest tightening until it felt like his ribs might crack. "And what am I?" he snarled, leaning forward, his hands twitching against the table. Malcolm mirrored him, closing the distance just enough to make the air between them crackle. His voice dropped, a whisper sharp enough to cut. "A man who thought he was untouchable. A man who believed his judgment was law. A man who never once stopped to ask if he was right till he became the one judged." Ryan's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the stillness. Malcolm's words were a mirror, reflecting a truth Brian had spent years avoiding. He'd wielded power like a weapon, deciding fates with the flick of a pen or the weight of his badge, never imagining he'd one day be the one on trial. Now, that power was gone, stripped away, leaving him exposed and raw. "You got what you wanted," he said, his voice breaking. "You ruined my life. What else do you want from me?" Malcolm watched him, his gaze steady and unyielding, then leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. Then he rose, adjusting his coat with a slow, deliberate motion, and exhaled softly. "I don't need to do anything else, Brian," he said, his tone quiet but laced with steel. "You've already destroyed yourself." The words struck like a hammer, reverberating through Brian's skull as Malcolm turned toward the door. He paused, one hand resting on the frame, and glanced back, his eyes piercing through the dim light. "I hope you remember this moment for the rest of your life," he said, his voice soft but final. "A parting gift wrapped in thorns." Then he stepped out, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that echoed like a gavel's fall. Ryan sat frozen, the cold silence of the room pressing down on him like a slab of stone. His hands shook against his thighs, his breath uneven, his mind a whirlwind of regret and realization. The walls seemed closer now, the air thicker, as if the room itself were shrinking to match the confines of his new reality. He'd spent years believing he was invincible, a king in a world of his own making. Every decision, every action, had been his to control until now. The lesson was brutal, etched into his bones with every passing second. Justice, when wielded without restraint, could turn on its master. Power, abused, became a noose, and Brian had tied it himself. As the silence stretched on, he felt the full weight of his downfall, not just the years ahead in a cell, but the unraveling of everything he'd once been. Malcolm's parting words lingered, a haunting refrain. This was his judgment, and no one was coming to lift the burden he'd brought upon himself. The door groaned as it swung open, its rusty hinges slicing through the oppressive silence that had settled over the room. Like a suffocating fog, Ryan sat at the scarred wooden table, his fingers twitching nervously against its surface, his breath shallow and uneven. The stillness had been unbearable, a heavy shroud that pressed against his chest, making every heartbeat feel like a struggle. Then Holloway stepped inside, his boots scuffing faintly against the worn linoleum floor. His face was a mask, impossible to read, but Brian caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his broad shoulders seemed to sag, the way his steps dragged as though each one carried the weight of an unspoken burden. Holloway didn't sit this time. He lingered near the door, his tall frame casting a long shadow that stretched across the room, his dark eyes fixed on Brian with an intensity that made the air feel colder. For a moment, neither man spoke. Holloway's gaze bore into Brian, searching, assessing, as if trying to peel back the layers of defiance or denial that might still linger. Ryan's throat tightened, a lump forming as he forced himself to meet that stare. Finally, Holloway exhaled a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry years of exhaustion and broke the silence. You know what's coming, don't you? His voice was low, steady, but there was a gravity to it that sent a shiver down Brian's spine. Brian swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in his throat, and gave a slow, reluctant nod. What was the point in pretending anymore? The decision had been made long before this moment, carved into stone by hands he couldn't see, in rooms he'd never enter. Fighting it now would be like screaming into a voidless, exhausting, and utterly futile. Holloway took a single step closer, the floor creaking beneath his weight. His voice dropped even lower, firm but laced with a quiet resolve. The DA's moving fast on this. They're done waiting. They want it wrapped up clean and quick. Make an example out of you. The words landed like a punch to Brian's gut, twisting his insides into knots. He forced a slow breath through his nose, trying to keep his composure, though his hands betrayed him, trembling faintly against the tabletop. "What's the offer?" he asked, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. Holloway hesitated, just for a heartbeat, his eyes narrowing as he studied Brian with a look that felt like it could see straight through him. Then he spoke, deliberate and measured. 2 years. No appeal, no bargaining. You take it, or you roll the dice in court. Brian's stomach lurched, a wave of nausea surging up as the reality of it sank in. 2 years. 2 years stripped away from his life, locked behind bars like an animal. And if he refused, Holloway's jaw tightened, the lines on his weathered face deepening as he answered the unspoken question. You go to trial. You lose. No question about it. The certainty in his tone was chilling, a cold blade sliding between Brian's ribs. He straightened in his chair, the movement stiff and mechanical, but it felt hollow, a meaningless gesture of pride in a moment when pride had long since abandoned him. And after the 2 years, he pressed, his voice cracking slightly. Holloway's eyes flicked over him, taking in the slump of his shoulders, the desperation lurking beneath his bravado. He shook his head slowly. You know how this works, Brian. You'll never wear that uniform again. No department in the country will touch you. Your pension's gone. You walk out of that cell if you're lucky, and you start over. If not, he let the sentence trail off, the unfinished threat hanging heavy in the air, sharp and ominous. Brian's fingers clenched against the table, nails digging into the wood as a bitter heat rose in his chest. So that's it. His voice was low, raw with anger and disbelief. 15 years gone, just like that. Holloway's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing into slits. 15 years of what, Brian? He snapped, his tone sharpening like a blade. 15 years of doing whatever the hell you wanted, because you thought no one would ever hold you accountable. You want sympathy? You want me to stand here and tell you this is unfair? His voice rose, cutting through the room with a ferocity that made Brian flinch. You think I don't know the kind of officer you were? That I didn't hear the complaints, see the reports piling up? You got away with a hell of a lot more than you should have, and now it's caught up with you. Brian's jaw clenched so tight it ached, his teeth grinding together as he fought to keep the flood of emotions at bay. Holloway's words were a mirror, reflecting back every choice, every shortcut, every time he'd bent the rules and convinced himself it was justified. I did my job, he muttered, the defense sounding weak even to his own ears. Holloway's laugh was sharp and bitter, a sound that echoed off the bare walls like a gunshot. Your job, he sneered. And what exactly do you think that was? Keeping men like Malcolm right in their place? Making sure people didn't get too comfortable thinking they had rights that applied to them? He shook his head, disgust etched into every line of his face. You weren't enforcing the law, Brian. You were enforcing your law, and now you're paying the price for it. The air between them crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. Brian looked away, unable to hold Holloway's gaze any longer. The weight in his chest grew heavier, pressing down until it felt like his ribs might crack under the strain. Holloway sighed, a sound of finality, and turned toward the door. I'm done here. Think about the deal. I'll be back when your lawyer's ready to finalize it. He paused, his hand on the knob, then glanced back over his shoulder. You should know Malcolm Wright didn't push for the maximum sentence. He could have made this a lot worse for you. Brian frowned, confusion and unease twisting in his gut. Why didn't he? Holloway's stare was long and unreadable, a puzzle with no clear answer. Maybe because he knows you'll never recover from this anyway. he said quietly, and with that, he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was crushing, a void that swallowed Brian whole. He sat there, alone, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of insects. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was days. Time lost all meaning, slipping through his fingers like sand. His mind churned, replaying Holloway's words, the deal, the life that had just been rewritten in a single conversation. When the door creaked open again, his lawyer stepped inside, his suit rumpled, his face etched with exhaustion. The man didn't say a word, just slid a thin stack of papers across the table, the plea agreement glaring up at Brian like a death warrant. Brian stared at it, his pulse thundering in his ears, drowning out the world. He reached for the pen, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the signature line. For 15 years, he'd been the one in control, one who made the calls, who held the power, who shaped the outcomes. Now, all that remained was this single sheet of paper, dictating the rest of his existence. His hand shook as he scrawled his name, the ink bleeding slightly into the page. The lawyer exhaled, a soft, tired sound, and slipped the document back into his briefcase. "It's done," he said simply. Brian let out a breath, slow and unsteady, the finality of it sinking into his bones like ice. He'd just admitted guilt. He'd just sealed his fate. There was no turning back, no undoing what he'd set in motion. The lawyer stood, gathering his things with the weary efficiency of someone who'd seen the scene play out too many times. "You'll be transferred to county holding until sentencing. After that, you serve your time, and then you're on your own." Brian didn't respond. What was there to say? The door swung open one last time, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their faces blank, their movements precise. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the metal glinting dully under the harsh light, and motioned for Brian to stand. He rose slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, and the cuffs snapped around his wrists with a cold, final click. They led him out of the room, down the sterile, echoing halls he'd once strode through with swagger and authority. Faces turned as he passed colleagues, subordinates, people who'd once nodded to him with respect. Now, their eyes held something else, pity, disdain, or simply indifference. The shift was palpable, a seismic crack running through the foundation of everything he'd built. He'd once believed men like Malcolm Wright were powerless, easily dismissed, silenced with a badge and a barked order. But as the officers guided him through the heavy steel doors of the system he'd once wielded like a club, the truth hit him with brutal clarity. The only one who'd ever been powerless was him. The courtroom was a sea of faces, every seat occupied, every pair of eyes trained on the front where Brian Carter stood, wrists bound in cuffs, his once crisp suit now wrinkled and hanging off him like a discarded skin. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, drained away, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man. The judge's voice boomed through the room, reading the charges with a stern finality that reverberated off the wood-paneled walls, like the tolling of a bell. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the trial pressing down on everyone present. In the front row, Malcolm Wright sat motionless, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his face an unreadable mask. He'd been there for every moment of rehearing, every meeting, every second when Brian was forced to sit in the dock of the system. He'd once championed without question. The irony wasn't lost on a single soul in that room. Malcolm could have demanded more. He could have pushed for the maximum sentence, could have buried Brian under a decade or more behind bars, but he hadn't. Not out of mercy, not out of weakness, but because he understood something Brian never had. True justice wasn't just about time served. True justice was the slow, relentless unraveling of a man's identity, the stripping away of everything he'd thought he was until all that remained was the bitter taste of his own reckoning. The judge's voice cut through the haze, sharp and unyielding. 2 years in state prison, with no possibility of appeal, effective immediately. Brian didn't flinch, didn't protest. There was no dramatic outburst, no desperate plea for mercy. Maybe he'd finally accepted the inevitable. Or maybe he simply didn't have the strength to pretend he still held any control. The officers approached, their boots thudding against the polished floor, and secured his cuffs once more. As they led him away, he kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet the stares of the crowd. His footsteps echoed, heavy and final, until he vanished behind the courtroom doors. The room exhaled as one, a collective release of breath. Justice had been served, but it wasn't just about Brian Carter. It was a reckoning, a moment that would linger in people's minds not just for what had happened, but for what it signified: the fall of a man who'd abused power, and the quiet strength of those he'd tried to crush. Malcolm stayed seated as the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of satisfaction and closure rippling through the air. He felt none of it, no triumph, no relief, just the steady weight of everything that had brought them here. A voice broke through his thoughts, low and rough. "It's over." He glanced up to see Holloway standing nearby, his face lined with fatigue, his eyes shadowed. There was no victory in his tone, only a bone-deep weariness. Malcolm studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. For him, maybe. Holloway rubbed a hand over his face, his fingers lingering on the stubble along his jaw. "You didn't have to come to every hearing," he said, his voice softer now. Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze steady. "Yes, I did." Holloway let out a tired chuckle, the sound devoid of humor, you know. "He used to be one of my best men. I really thought he was something special." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, he looked older, worn thin by the years and the choices he'd witnessed. Malcolm didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Holloway's words hung between them, a faint echo of a past that had crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. Justice had been served, yes, but it was a lesson carved in blood and ruin, a reminder that power, when twisted, inevitably turned on its wielder. And as the courtroom emptied, leaving only the ghosts of what had been, that lesson lingered, sharp and unshakable, in the stillness. The sun dipped low over Sacramento, casting golden streaks across the sky, tinged with amber hues that softened the edges of the bustling city. Eric Porter maneuvered his sedan through the evening traffic, the engine humming a quiet tune as he adjusted the air conditioning to fend off the lingering heat of the day. The faint melody of the radio drifted through the cabin, a gentle counterpoint to the urban clamor outside. He was tired, bone deep tired after a long day at the office, and all he wanted was the comfort of home, a glass of water, and the chance to let the weight of his responsibilities slip away for a few hours. As he approached a yellow light, he eased off the accelerator, watching it flicker to red just as he came to a stop. A moment of peace settled over him, fleeting but welcome. Then the world erupted into chaos. Blue and red lights blazed in his rearview mirror, sharp and insistent, accompanied by the piercing wail of a siren that jolted his senses. Eric's brow furrowed, a ripple of confusion cutting through his calm. He glanced back, then carefully guided his car to the side of the road, rolling down his window as the police cruiser pulled up behind him. The evening air rushed in, warm and thick, carrying the distant hum of the city. Out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut that accentuated the hard lines of his face, and a badge that gleamed like a challenge on his chest. Larson adjusted his belt as he approached, his stride deliberate, almost theatrical, exuding the kind of confidence that came from years of wielding authority without question. "License and registration," Larson said, his voice flat but edged with a quiet demand. Like a blade sheathed but ready to be drawn, Eric didn't hesitate. He reached into the glove compartment, his movements steady and practiced, retrieving the requested documents and handing them over with a calm that belied the sudden tension coiling in his chest. He could feel Larson's eyes on him, heavy and searching, as if the officer were already sifting through invisible evidence, looking for a crack to exploit. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning closer to the window, his breath faintly audible over the hum of passing cars. Eric met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not entirely sure," he replied, his tone even, polite but firm, the kind of voice that carried weight without raising its volume. Larson tilted his head, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face before he pressed on. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light." The words hung there, uncertain, as if Larson himself weren't entirely convinced of their truth. Eric frowned slightly, nodding in acknowledgement. "I see. I thought I'd slowed down in time, but I understand." His response was measured, reasonable. Yet it seemed to unsettle Larson further. The officer didn't reply immediately. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Eric with an intensity that went beyond a simple traffic stop. The air between them shifted, growing taut, as if an invisible line had been crossed. Larson's posture stiffened subtly, his shoulders squaring as though he'd already decided this was more than a routine encounter. He glanced down at the license in his hand, his fingers tightening around it. "You're not from around here, are you?" The question came out sharp, probing, less a query and more an accusation. Eric paused, just for a heartbeat, before answering. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't listening yet really. His focus had shifted, his questions taking on a harder edge, as if the traffic violation were merely a pretext for something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson pressed, leaning in closer, his shadow falling across Eric's lap. "Just going home," Eric replied, his voice steady as stone, though he could feel the subtle crackle of tension building around them. Larson didn't see a driver anymore, he saw a suspect, a puzzle to unravel. Eric sensed it too. The way the officer's gaze sharpened, the way his hand hovered near his belt, not quite resting but ready. But Eric didn't flinch. He'd faced scrutiny before, and he knew how to hold his ground without giving an inch. Larson stepped back, folding Eric's documents with exaggerated care, tucking them into his chest pocket as if claiming them as leverage. His expression hardened, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as though he'd already judged the man before him and found him wanting. "Step out of the car for me," he ordered, his tone clipped, authoritative, leaving no room for negotiation. Eric's grip tightened briefly on the steering wheel, a flicker of frustration pulsing through him. But his face remained a mask of calm. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice still measured, still polite, but carrying a quiet challenge beneath it. Larson's lips twitched, a flash of irritation breaking through his composure before he masked it. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The threat lingered, unspoken but palpable, a shadow cast by the weight of his badge. Eric exhaled slowly, a deliberate release of the tension building in his chest, and opened the door. As he stepped out, the warm pavement pressed against his polished shoes, grounding him. He stood a little taller than Larson, his broad shoulders filling out the tailored suit that spoke of professionalism, of a life built on discipline and care. Yet none of that seemed to matter to the officer, whose eyes flicked over him, sizing him up like a predator assessing its prey. "Hands where I can see them," Larson said, gesturing toward the front of the car. Eric complied, his movements smooth and deliberate, his palms open and steady. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" he asked, his tone calm but pointed, a question that demanded an answer. Larson smirked faintly, a glint of smugness in his eyes. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the officer. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, cutting through the pretense, and for a moment Larson's mask slipped. His hand drifted toward his belt, a reflex born of unease, and his voice hardened. "Watch your tone. I'm simply asking a question," Eric replied, his voice unshaken, a pillar of quiet strength that seemed to rattle Larson more than any defiance could. The officer scoffed, stepping back to pace a small circle in front of the car, his boots scuffing the asphalt. The dynamic was shifting, slipping out of his control, and he didn't like it. Eric wasn't reacting the way he expected, nervous, compliant, afraid. Instead, he stood there, calm and composed, a man who knew more than he let on. Little did Larson know that calm wasn't naivete, it was power, carefully restrained, waiting for its moment. Months later, in a courtroom bathed in the muted glow of late afternoon, Malcolm Wright sat at the bench, his gavel resting beside him like a silent sentinel. The room buzzed with the low murmur of lingering spectators, their voices a distant hum against the weight of what had just transpired. He'd watched Holloway, his longtime colleague, rise from his seat after their final exchange, a long, measured look passing between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Malcolm had seen the flicker of realization in Holloway's eyes, a dawning acceptance of a truth he'd ignored for too long. Without a word, Holloway had nodded, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, and then turned, his silhouette swallowed by the sea of faces still milling about the room. Malcolm lingered in his chair, the wood creaking faintly beneath him as he absorbed the gravity of the moment. His hands rested on the bench, fingers tracing the worn grain, grounding him as his mind churned. Something had shifted not just within him, but in the air itself, a ripple that extended beyond the courtroom's walls. Justice had arrived today, not with fanfare or thunder, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide turning. He rose slowly, his robes rustling, and stepped out into the world beyond those doors, feeling the change settle into his bones. It wasn't easy, this work. It never had been. But today it had mattered. Meanwhile, Ryan Carteran's Officer Bradley Larson sat in a cell that seemed to shrink with every passing day. The walls, cold and unyielding, pressed in on him, a constant reminder of the life he'd lost. 2 years had crawled by, each one heavier than the last, stripping away the man he'd once been. He'd spent his career judging others, dismissing them, reducing them to less than human with the flick of a pen or the flash of his badge. Now, he lived among the men he'd once lorded over, men who now looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the authority he'd once wielded. The respect he'd demanded was gone, replaced by a hollow silence that echoed in his chest. There were no shortcuts here, no rank to shield him, just time endless, unforgiving time that stretched out before him like a desert with no horizon. When he finally walked out of that prison, he was a shadow, a ghost of the man who'd once stood tall in his uniform. His badge was gone, his career a memory, his future a blank slate smeared with the stains of his past. The world had moved on, leaving him behind, and he had no choice but to stumble forward. A name whispered in cautionary tales told over late-night drinks. The scars of his actions clung to him, a weight he'd carry to his grave, and in that, perhaps, lay the truest form of justice, and not punishment alone, but the relentless mirror of consequence. Malcolm Wright, on the other hand, pressed forward. From his bench, his rulings carried a new weight, each decision a stone laid in the foundation of something greater. His name had grown beyond a mere tightlight, was a beacon now, a symbol of accountability, a promise of a new era, yet he never let it define him. The work was endless, the battles ceaseless, and he met them with the same quiet resolve he'd always carried. Justice wasn't a single victory. He knew it was the meaning behind that victory, the ripples it sent into the world, and those ripples he'd make sure would endure. Eric Porter, the man at the center of it all, had long since returned to his quiet life, but that evening on the Sacramento streets had changed everything. He'd stood there, unflinching, as Larson's assumptions unraveled, as the officer's power crumbled under the weight of its own misuse. Eric had known who he was, knew the truth Larson couldn't see, and in the end, that truth had prevailed. He'd walked away from that encounter not as a victim, but as the catalyst, the man who'd held a mirror to a system too long unchecked. And so the story lingered, a testament to the fragile dance between power and responsibility. Larson's fall wasn't just a personal reckoning, it was a warning, a lesson etched in the lives he'd touched. Justice, when it came, wasn't loud or immediate. It was patient, persistent, a force that found its way through the cracks of arrogance and pride. For every Holloway who saw the light too late, for every Carter who bore the scars of his own making, there was a Malcolm, an Eric, ready to tip the scales. And in that balance, the world found its depth, its meaning, its hope. In a world where fear might have reigned, where trembling hands, stuttering words, or anxious ticks could have betrayed a man's nervous, there was none of that. Instead, an unshakable stillness hung in the air, a quiet mastery that radiated from Eric like a steady pulse. His every movement was deliberate, his posture erect yet relaxed, exuding a poise that seemed almost unnatural under the circumstances. It wasn't just confidence, it was something deeper, something that gnawed at Officer Larson's instincts, setting his nerves alight with unease. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the deserted stretch of road, the glint of light bouncing off the sleek black sedan parked haphazardly on the gravel shoulder. Larson stood a few paces away, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor fraying at the edges, his fingers twitching as though itching for something to grasp control, perhaps, or certainty. "You seem pretty damn sure of yourself," Larson muttered, the words slipping out under his breath, almost as if he hadn't meant to say them aloud. His voice carried a rough edge, the kind honed by years of barking orders and expecting obedience. He squinted at Eric, searching for a crack in the man's facade, a flinch or a falter he could seize upon. But Eric didn't bite. He tilted his head ever so slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if the tension between them hadn't sharpened every detail into focus. "Confidence isn't what's at stake here, officer," Eric replied, his tone smooth and measured, like a river flowing over polished stones. "Respect is." The word landed like a pebble tossed into still water, rippling outward. And for a fleeting moment, Larson froze, his hand, hovering near his belt, stilled mid-motion, and his smirk a crooked, self-assured thing slid off his face, replaced by something harder, something defensive that flickered in his hazel eyes. He turned fully to face Eric now, his broad shoulders squaring as if to reclaim the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. His lips parted, ready to fire back a retort, but the words lodged in his throat, choked by the weight of Eric's unflappable calm. That silence stretched between them, taut and electric, a live wire humming with unspoken challenges. Larson's chest tightened. He wasn't used to this. He thrived on the predictable drivers who stammered apologies, who averted their eyes, who shrank under the shadow of his badge. But Eric met his gaze head-on, his dark eyes steady and unyielding, and it threw Larson off balance in a way he couldn't quite name. The realization crept in slowly, prickling the back of his neck. This wasn't going to unfold the way he'd scripted it in his head. And yet, instead of retreating, he dug in deeper, as if doubling down might somehow wrench the situation back under his command. His fingers drummed a staccato rhythm against the leather holster strapped to his hip, a restless tick that betrayed the frustration simmering beneath his gruff exterior. Larson wasn't accustomed to being questioned by anyone, and certainly not by someone like Eric, with his pressed shirt and quiet demeanor that didn't fit the profile Larson had already sketched in his mind. His gaze darted back to the sedan, its tinted windows gleaming under the fading light, as if the car itself might offer up some excuse he hadn't yet conjured. "Turn around," he snapped, his voice clipped and sharp, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Hands on the hood. I need to check you for weapons." The order was rote, mechanical, but there was an undercurrent of something else, danger, maybe, or a desperate need to reassert dominance. Eric's brow arched, a faint curve of skepticism that carried more weight than any outburst could have. "Weapons?" he echoed, his voice tinged with incredulity, but still maddeningly even. "Do I strike you as the type to carry a weapon, officer?" The question hung there, light as air but heavy with implication, and Larson's jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched visibly beneath his skin. For a split second, his mask slipped, his nostrils flared, his eyes narrowed, and the cracks in his composure glinted like shards of glass catching the sun. "I'm not asking again," he growled, his tone a low rumble, but the edge of it wavered, betraying the uncertainty he refused to acknowledge. Eric paused, and in that heartbeat of hesitation, something unreadable flickered across his face, misment, perhaps, or a shadow of pity. Then, without a word, he turned slowly, deliberately, and pressed his palms flat against the sedan's hood. The metal was warm from the day's heat, a stark contrast to the chill creeping into the air as dusk approached. Larson stepped forward, his boots crunching against the loose asphalt, each sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. He patted Eric down with quick, rough motions, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of routine, but lingering a fraction too long over Eric's shoulders, down his sides, along his legs. It wasn't just a search, it was a performance, a silent declaration of power meant to provoke, to unsettle. But Eric didn't react. His body remained still, his breathing steady, his silence louder than any protest could have been. Larson stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. "You're clean," he muttered, the words begrudging, spat out like they tasted bitter on his tongue. He sounded almost disappointed, as if he'd been robbed of the justification he'd been fishing for. Eric straightened and turned to face him, his expression serene, but his eyes piercing, like a blade honed to a fine edge. "Of course I am," he said simply, his voice soft but firm, a quiet rebuke wrapped in civility. "Now, officer, if you're finished." "I'm not finished," Larson cut in, his voice rising a notch, the words tumbling out too fast, too eager, as if he could claw back control by sheer volume. His need to dominate the moment pulsed beneath every syllable, raw and unpolished. Eric folded his arms across his chest, his posture relaxed despite the crackling tension that seemed to charge the air between them. "You seem to know an awful lot about what I can and can't do," Larson pressed, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Care to explain why?" A faint smile tugged at the corner of Eric's mouth, subtle but deliberate. "I've had my fair share of run-ins with law enforcement," he said, his tone casual, almost conversational. "Let's just say I've picked up a thing or two over the years." The vagueness of it, the calm delivery, only fueled Larson's irritation. He stepped closer, encroaching on Eric's space, his breath hot and uneven. "What's that supposed to mean? You a lawyer or something?" His voice dropped to a near growl, a challenge laced with disdain. "Or something," Eric replied, the ambiguity a spark tossed onto dry tinder. Larson bristled, his hands curling into loose fists at his sides. He loomed over Eric now, close enough that the faint scent of sweat and cheap coffee clung to the air between them. "Listen," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric didn't flinch. He met Larson's glare with an even stare, his calm unshaken. "I don't think anything, officer," he said, his words deliberate, each one landing like a stone. "I just believe in fairness. And right now, I'm not seeing much of it." The accusation hung there, bold and unyielding, and Larson seized it like a lifeline. "Fairness?" He scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think this is about fairness? People like you always." He stopped himself mid-sentence, the words choking off as if he'd caught them just before they could spill out fully. But the damage was done. The air thickened with the weight of what he'd almost said, the implication lingering like a storm cloud. Eric's expression didn't shift, but his stance subtly tight in that coiled readiness, a signal he'd heard every unsaid word loud and clear. "People like me," Eric repeated, his voice soft but electric, charged with a meaning that cut deeper than any shout. Larson flinched, stepping back as if the ground beneath him had shifted. "You know what I mean," he muttered, but the bravado had drained from his tone, leaving it hollow, uncertain. "I think I do," Eric said quietly, his calm no longer passive but sharp, slicing through the pretense with surgical precision. "And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic stop a long time ago." Larson opened his mouth, searching for a retort, but nothing came. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes, a crack in the armor of his certainty. The balance of power tilted, imperceptibly at first, then all at once, and he felt the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd thought. But before he could scramble to regain his footing, Eric's voice cut through the silence, steady and resolute. "Officer," he said, "I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows were upon together, irritation flaring anew. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, but the faint tremor in his voice betrayed him. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, telegraphing every intention. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, his eyes locked on Larson's, watching the officer's hand twitch toward his holster. "No need for drama. I just want you to see it." He pulled out a slim leather wallet, flipped it open with a flick of his wrist, and revealed a polished badge that caught the dying light. "Eric Porter," he said, his tone as casual as if he were offering his name over a handshake. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." The world seemed to stop. Larson's breath hitched, his eyes darting from the badge to Eric's face, searching for a hint of deception, a punchline to this impossible twist. But there was non-ageist quiet authority and a trace of disappointment in Eric's steady gaze. "Internal Affairs," Larson rasped, his voice breaking slightly. "You're—" "Yes," Eric cut in, sparing him the struggle of finishing. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to make sure the people wearing that badge," he nodded toward the shield, pinned to Larson's chest, uphold the integrity and values it's supposed to stand for. Larson's face drained of color, his earlier bravado unraveling like thread pulled from a seam. He took a small, involuntary step back, his hand dropping from his belt as if it suddenly weighed too much to hold. Eric stepped forward, closing the gap Larson had created, his presence commanding without effort. "Do you know what troubles me most about this, Officer Larson?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing, each word a needle threading through the silence. Larson didn't respond. He looked like a man staring down a precipice, too stunned to move. "It's not the profiling, though that's bad enough," Eric continued. "It's not even the way you escalated this without cause. It's that you did all of it without even considering who I might be. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, wouldn't understand the laws you're supposed to enforce. And why?" Larson's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Eric's gaze bore into him, relentless yet composed. "Because I didn't match your picture of someone who deserves respect," he finished, his words not loud but heavy, an indictment wrapped in quiet truth. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for every single person you meet in that uniform." Larson's shoulders slumped, the weight of Eric's words crashing down like a tide. He glanced at the badge again, as if willing it to vanish, but it remained solid, real, a symbol of the reckoning now unfolding. Eric stepped back, giving Larson room to breathe, but his voice retained its edge. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to hand me my documents, take a step back, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson's lips parted, a protest forming, but he hesitated, caught between defiance and surrender. That pause was his undoing. And then Eric added, his voice dropping lower, "You're going to hear from me again. Not as some driver you pulled over, but as the man who decides whether you're fit to wear that badge." Larson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as the gravity of the moment sank in. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his chest pocket, pulled out Eric's license and registration, and handed them over. Eric took them without a word, tucking them into his wallet with the same deliberate calm that had defined every move he'd made. He stepped toward his car, one hand resting on the door handle, and paused. The air was thick with the lessons of justice soon spoken, but palpable, and the consequences of power wielded without thought. For Larson, it was a moment he'd carry long after the dust settled, a mirror held up to his own flaws, reflecting a truth he could no longer ignore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty Sacramento street, Eric Porter caught Officer Bradley Larson's gaze one final time in the dimming light. Eric's voice carried a quiet intensity, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Look at me, Larson. And don't you forget this. That badge pinned to your chest doesn't lift you above anyone. It binds you to answer to everyone." Larson stood frozen, his broad shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of Eric's words. The officer's usual swagger faltered, his sharp jaw tightening as a flicker of doubt crept into his hazel eyes. For Eric, though, this wasn't the end of a chapter, it was the spark igniting something much bigger. As he eased back into his weathered sedan, the engine growled to life, a low rumble that mirrored the storm brewing in his mind. Larson remained rooted to the spot, a solitary figure silhouetted against the fading orange sky, his once certain future now teetering on the edge of a cliff. The drive home was a silent one, the hum of tires on asphalt the only sound filling the car. But inside Eric's head, a symphony of thoughts played on repeat. The confrontation with Larson wasn't some rare clash, it was a scene he'd lived through too many times before. Each replay brought a fresh wave of frustration, tinged with a steely resolve. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening as he pictured Larson's smug face. The way the officer had leaned into his authority like it was a shield. It wasn't just Larson. Thoth was a single thread in a tangled web of arrogance and unchecked power that Eric had seen woven through the department for years. This time, though, Eric wasn't just a bystander. This time, he held the reins, and he was determined to pull hard. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the slatted blinds of Eric's office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, painting golden stripes across his cluttered desk. He sat there, a towering figure even in stillness, his dark eyes fixed on an open file. Officer Bradley Larson. The pages told a story of a man who'd skated by on the edges of accountability, Complaints of brusque behavior, questionable traffic stops, and murky misunderstandings that never quite stuck. Eric leaned back in his chair, the creak of leather punctuating the quiet as he steepled his fingers. His mind drifted beyond the file, beyond Larson himself, to the festering rot beneath it all. Larson wasn't a lone bad apple, was a glaring symptom of a sickness that ran deep. A culture where power too often trumped duty. Eric's jaw tightened. He wasn't here to slap a quick fix on a gaping wound. He wanted to cut out the infection at its root. A soft knock broke his reverie, and the door swung open to reveal Linda, his assistant. She was a slight woman with a no-nonsense bob of graying hair, her arms cradling a thick stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said, her voice crisp yet warm, like a teacher addressing a favored student. "Here's the rundown on last month's misconduct cases. Oh, and Chief Daniels asked me to remind you about next week's department review." Eric offered a curt nod, reaching out to take the files. "Thanks, Linda. One more thing, can you set up a meeting with the chief this afternoon? I've got something he needs to hear." Linda paused, her sharp eyes catching the edge in his tone. She didn't press, though. She knew better. "Of course," she replied. Her words clipped, but laced with a quiet understanding before she slipped out, leaving Eric alone with his thoughts once more. He turned back to Larson's file, but his focus stretched far beyond the officer's petty infractions. This wasn't about one man's missteps, it was about the system that propped him up. The unspoken rules that let men like Larson wield their badges like crowns. Justice, Eric knew, wasn't just a word, it was a promise, and it started with the people at the top. That afternoon, he found himself seated across from Chief Daniels in a stark conference room, the air thick with tension. Daniels, a grizzled veteran with salt and pepper hair and a face carved from years of hard choices, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His deep-set eyes studied Eric as he recounted the traffic stop with Larson, every detail laid bare. "I could have brushed it off as just another rough day," Eric said, his voice steady as granite. "But that'd be letting it slide. Larson's not a one-off, he's a mirror showing us how much we've still got to fix." Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the department rested there. "Larson's name's come up before," he admitted, his gravelly voice tinged with reluctance. "We've always kept it in-house, handled it quietly." Eric's gaze sharpened. "That's the problem. Chief, quiet doesn't heal, it festers. It's time we stop whispering and start shouting." Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasping on the table, knuckles scarred from decades on the job. "What's your play here?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and wariness. "A full review." Eric shot back without a beat. "Not just officer training, protocols, the whole damn system. We can't keep burying this if we don't demand better from ourselves. How can we expect the public to believe in us?" A faint smirk tugged at Daniel's lips, though his eyes stayed heavy. "You're gonna stir up a hornet's nest." Eric met his stare, unflinching. "Good, it's overdue." The weeks that followed were a blur of chaos and purpose. Eric threw himself into the fight, poring over stacks of data, grilling officers in tense interviews, and standing before restless crowds at public forums. His voice carried the weight of conviction as he listened to residents angry. Some weary share their stories of brushes with the law gone wrong. The Larson incident wasn't just a spark anymore. It was a blazing torch, illuminating cracks the department had ignored for too long. Larson himself faced an internal hearing, and Eric was there, front and center. His presence a silent thunderclap. The officer squirmed in his seat, his bravado crumbling under the spotlight. His suspension came swift and sharp, but Eric's eyes were on a bigger present, just punishing one man, but forging a path to stop the next. Months later, Eric stood at a podium in a packed community hall, the room buzzing with a mix of uniformed officers, city officials, and everyday folks. The air hummed with anticipation as he spoke, his words deliberate and clear. "This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about owning our duty. Justice isn't chasing down criminals, it's ensuring those who wear this badge do it with honor, fairness, and respect for every soul they meet. That's the standard I stand for, and that's what we're building, together." The applause roared through the space, a wave of sound that crashed over him. But Eric didn't bask in it. He stepped down, scanning the crowd, some faces skeptical, others lit with fragile hope. Change wouldn't come fast, he knew that, but it would come. And for now, that flicker of progress was enough to keep him pushing forward. Meanwhile, on a bustling Tuesday evening in a Sacramento supermarket, another story unfolded. Nathaniel Davis, a 48-year-old retired Army veteran, moved through the aisles with quiet purpose. Dressed in a faded navy sweatshirt and jeans, he blended into the crowd of shoppers, his cart half full with the makings of a simple meal. The soft clatter of carts and the steady beep of checkout scanners filled the air, a mundane rhythm that grounded him after years of military precision. As he reached for a carton of almond milk in the dairy section, a prickle of awareness tugged at him. Turning slightly, he glimpsed here a white police officer in a crisp uniform, standing stiffly at the aisle's edge, her eyes locked on him, unyielding, her hand hovering near her holster. Nathaniel's pulse quickened, but he tamped it down with the discipline of a soldier. He offered a polite nod, his lips curving into a faint, disarming smile. Her face didn't soften. If anything, her stare grew colder, a silent accusation he couldn't decipher. Shrugging it off, he pushed his cart toward the canned goods, the wheels squeaking faintly. But the weight of her gaze clung to him, heavy and persistent. Each glance over his shoulder confirmed it was trailing him, her steps deliberate, her posture coiled like a spring. By the time he reached the frozen foods, the unease had settled deep in his gut. This wasn't vigilance, it was something else, something personal. He tightened his grip on the cart, steeling himself against the rising tension. Pausing near the produce section, Nathaniel bent to inspect a bundle of spinach, his mind drifting to the quiet dinners he'd cook, small anchors in a civilian life. He was still adjusting to. Then her voice sliced through the air, sharp and commanding. "Excuse me, sir, I need to speak with you." He turned slowly, his broad frame steady, his expression a mask of calm forged in countless high-stakes moments. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice low and even, betraying none of the storm churning inside. She stepped closer, her boots clicking against the tiled floor, her eyes narrowing as if searching for a crack in his composure. The supermarket's hum faded into a distant buzz, and in that moment, Nathaniel knew this encounter, like Eric's with Larsan, was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one woven with lessons of justice and the steep cost of power misused. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the aisles where shoppers moved with quiet purpose. Nathaniel stood near the produce section, his hands resting lightly on the handle of a cart half filled with spinach, almond milk, and a few other essentials. He was a man of routine, his broad shoulders squared from years of military discipline, though his posture softened now in the civilian world he'd fought so hard to protect. His dark eyes scanned the leafy greens, lost in the mundane rhythm of grocery shopping, when a sharp voice sliced through the hum of the store. Her eyes narrowed into slits as she approached, her boots clicking against the linoleum floor with a deliberate rhythm that echoed authority. The officer, her uniform crisp and her badge glinting under the artificial light, sized him up from head to toe with a scrutiny that felt like a physical weight. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," she said, her tone clipped and cold, as though the words were a formality she'd rehearsed too many times. "I need to know what you're doing here." Nathaniel blinked, the accusation hitting him like a sudden gust of wind, stirring a flicker of disbelief in his chest. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind racing to process the absurdity of the question. "I'm grocery shopping," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet incredulity. He gestured toward his cart, the contents a testament to his ordinary intent, nothing more than a man gathering provisions for the week ahead, just like everyone else. Her gaze darted to the cart, lingering briefly on the neatly stacked items, before snapping back to his face with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "I'm going to need to see some identification," she demanded, her hand shifting slightly toward her holster, a subtle but unmistakable escalation that sent a ripple of tension through Nathaniel's frame. "Identification," he echoed, a soft laugh escaping his lips knit out of amusement. But from the sheer ridiculousness of it all, he shook his head, his short-cropped hair catching the light as he struggled to keep his composure. "For buying spinach and almond milk. With all due respect, officer, I haven't done anything wrong." Is there a specific reason you're asking me for ID? His words were measured, polite, but beneath them simmered a growing unease, a recognition of something he'd faced often before. Her jaw tightened, the muscles flexing visibly as her hand settled more firmly on the holstered weapon at her hip. The gesture was silent but deafening, a warning that turned the casual hum of the supermarket into a charged stillness. "Sir," she said, her voice hardening, "I'm not going to ask again. Show me your ID." The air thickened between them, a palpable wall of tension that seemed to press against Nathaniel's chest. He could feel the eyes of other shoppers' fleeting glances at first, then lingering stares bring into him, their curiosity morphing into something heavier, something judgmental. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, Nathaniel weighed his options, his mind flickering back to moments of discipline honed on battlefields, far from this fluorescent-lit aisle. "Look," he began, his tone calm but firm, "I don't know what you think I've done, but I'm not required to show ID just because I'm walking through a store. If there's a specific accusation, let's address it. Otherwise, I'd like to finish my shopping and go home." His hands remained steady, resting lightly on the cart, but inside, a quiet storm brewed, a mix of frustration and a weary familiarity with this dance of suspicion. The officer's face darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line as her tone sharpened into something jagged. "I saw you acting suspiciously," she snapped, her words slicing through the murmurs of the growing crowd. "Walking up and down the aisles like you're casing the place. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Her accusation landed like a punch, and Nathaniel felt it deep in his gut, not because it was true, but because it was so achingly predictable. He was no stranger to this, the way assumptions clung to him like shadows he couldn't shake. He'd faced it in uniform, his medals and service dismissed by those who saw only the color of his skin. But here, in a supermarket of all places, the sting felt sharper, more absurd. Before he could respond, her voice rose, cutting through the ambient noise and drawing more ice, more phones, their lenses glinting like tiny spotlights. "If you're refusing to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to take further action." The threat hung heavy, and Nathaniel's pulse quickened not from fear for himself, but from the sudden awareness of how fast this could spiral. He raised his hands slightly, palms open in a gesture of peace, though his mind churned with the injustice of it all. "I'm cooperating, officer," he said, his voice steady as steel. "I'm just asking for a little respect." Respect, it seemed, was a luxury not on offer tonight. Her next words shattered the fragile calm of the store, her voice booming with an authority that felt unearned. "Hands where I can see them now." Her hand gripped the handle of her gun, and in an instant, the atmosphere shifted. The soft rustle of shopping bags and the murmur of casual conversation gave way to a stunned silence. Shoppers froze mid-step, their carts abandoned as their eyes darted between Nathaniel and the officer. A mother clutched her young daughter's hand, pulling her closer, while an elderly man with a cane gripped it tighter, his weathered face twisting in disapproval. Nathaniel's heart pounded, a rapid drumbeat echoing in his ears. He'd trained for high-stakes moments, gunfire, chaos, life-or-death decisions, but this was different. This was a supermarket aisle, surrounded by innocent people, children watching wide-eyed as the scene unfolded, keeping his hands raised. He spoke with a calm that belied the storm inside him. "Officer, there's no need for this. I've done nothing wrong." But her eyes blazed with suspicion, her grip on the gun tightening as she barked, "Get down on the ground now." The command struck him like a blow, and for a moment, he hesitated, lying on the grimy supermarket floor sticky with spilled soda, and tracked in dirt felt like a surrender to far, a humiliation that clawed at his dignity. Around him, the crowd swelled, phones raised like a forest of accusing fingers, capturing every second of this unfolding nightmare. The stakes crystallized in his mind. One wrong move, and this could end in tragedy, not just for him, but for everyone watching. Slowly, he crouched, lowering himself to his knees, the cold linoleum biting into his skin through his jeans. "Stay down," she snapped, her gun now fully drawn and aimed at him. The barrel a dark void that seemed to swallow the light. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a wave of shock and outrage. A young mother turned her son's face away, shielding his eyes from the sight, while the elderly man muttered under his breath, his voice rough with indignation. "What is she doing? He hasn't done anything." Nathaniel's gaze lifted from his position on the floor, meeting the officer's eyes with a steadiness that carried the weight of his years. "Officer," he said, his voice firm but threaded with a quiet power, "I am a retired senior Army officer. I've served this country for over 20 years. Whatever this is, it's not right." Her lips twitched, a fleeting shadow of doubt crossing her face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She doubled down, her voice cold and unyielding. "Don't move. You don't get to decide what's right or wrong here." But the crowd wasn't so easily silenced. Their murmurs grew louder, a rising tide of defiance sparked by Nathaniel's composure. A burly man in a flannel shirt stepped forward, his phone clutched in one meaty hand, his voice booming with righteous anger. "Lady, you're out of line. He hasn't done anything. Put the gun away." The officer's head snapped toward him, her glare venomous. "Step back. This doesn't concern you." But it did concern them, every single one of them. More voices joined the chorus, a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. "What's he done?" a woman shouted, her voice trembling with fury as she cradled a toddler on her hip. "Why are you pulling a gun on him?" Nathaniel glanced at the crowd, gratitude flickering in his chest, though his focus remained locked on the officer. He knew this moment teetered on a knife's edge in wrong breath, and it could all collapse. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and deliberate, as if they were the only two people in the room. "Please, take a step back and think this through." She wasn't listening. The situation had slipped from her grasp, spiraling into chaos she couldn't contain. The tension in the store reached a fever pitch when a new voice cleaved through the deep, authoritative tone that demanded attention. "What's going on here?" The store manager, Greg, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a name tag pinned crookedly to his vest, strode into the fray, his face a mask of bewildered determination. Behind him trailed Trevor, a lanky young security guard whose wide eyes betrayed his shock at the scene before him. The drawn gun, Nathaniel kneeling on the floor, the crowd bristling with phones and fury. Greg planted himself between Nathaniel and the officer, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "Officer, this is a grocery store, not a crime scene. What exactly are you accusing this man of?" The officer didn't flinch, her gun still raised, though her grip seemed less certain. "Suspicious behavior," she replied tersely. "I have reason to believe he's shoplifting and potentially armed." Trevor, hovering nervously at Greg's side, exchanged a quick glance with his boss before stepping forward. His voice trembled slightly, but there was a conviction in it that cut through the tension. "Ma'am, I've been monitoring the security cameras. This gentleman hasn't done anything suspicious. He's just been shopping, picking out groceries like everyone else." The officer's eyes narrowed, her skepticism hardening her features. "Are you sure about that?" "Absolutely," Trevor shot back, his confidence growing as he squared his narrow shoulders. "I can pull up the footage right now if you'd like. Every move he's made is on tap, and nothing but a guy trying to buy his groceries." Nathaniel, still kneeling, let out a small, relieved breath, though he kept his hands raised. "You see, officer," he said, his tone gentle but pointed, "there's no reason for this." The crowd's murmurs swelled into a chorus of agreement, their voices rising like a tide. "Let him up," a man bellowed, his face red with indignation. "You're way out of line," another shouted, her words sharp with exasperation. Greg took a cautious step closer, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Officer, I think it's time to de-escalate. This isn't what you think it is." Her grip on the gun wavered, her eyes darting between the crowd, the cameras, and the two men standing firm before her. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, the realization that she was losing control sinking in like a stone. Finally, after an agonizing stretch of silence that felt like hours, she took a step back and lowered the weapon, holstering it with a jerky motion. "You're free to go," she said, her voice curt and brittle, devoid of apology. Nathaniel rose slowly, brushing the dust from his jeans with deliberate care, his movements steady despite the tremor of frustration coursing through him. "Free to go," he repeated, his voice low but heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. "I've been humiliated in front of all these people, treated like a criminal, and for what? Because I'm shopping while black?" Her face flushed, a deep crimson creeping up her neck, but she offered no response. Instead, she turned on her heel and strode toward the exit, her boots echoing against the floor as she ignored the crowd's lingering murmurs, and the phones still trained on her retreating figure. Trevor stepped forward, his young face creased with genuine remorse. "Sir, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. If there's anything we can do." Nathaniel raised a hand, cutting him off with a tight but understanding smile. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But this can't keep happening." He gathered his cart, the mundane weight of his groceries a stark contrast to the ordeal he'd just endured, and made his way out of the store. Behind him, the videos captured that night were already beginning their journey across the digital landscape, igniting a firestorm that would demand answers. By the time Nathaniel reached the quiet sanctuary of his home, his phone was alive with a relentless buzz: friends, family, former colleagues, all reaching out with a mix of concern and outrage. Links to the videos flooded his inbox. The footage of the officer drawing her gun on him in the middle of a Sacramento supermarket, spreading like wildfire across social media. Captions screamed injustice, racial profiling at its worst. Black veteran humiliated for grocery shopping, and within hours, local news stations picked up the story. Their broadcasts soon echoed by national networks. Hashtags like Justice for Nathaniel and Racial profiling surged into the zeitgeist, uniting voices from every corner of the country in a swell of fury and solidarity. Veterans groups issued scathing statements, condemning the officer's actions as a betrayal of the values Nathaniel had served to uphold, while civil rights organizations demanded a reckoning, their calls for investigation reverberating through the airwaves. In the stillness of his living room, Nathaniel sat with the weight of it all: humiliation, the fear, the fleeting hope sparked by the crowd's support. He thought of the officer, her unchecked power a stark reminder of how fragile justice could be when wielded by those who refused to see. And he thought of the lesson etched into this moment, that the abuse of authority carried consequence not just for the one who suffered, but for a society forced to confront its reflection in the cold linoleum of a supermarket aisle. The firestorm was just beginning, and Nathaniel knew it would burn long after the headlines faded, a testament to the enduring fight for what was right. Nathaniel's phone buzzed incessantly on the cluttered kitchen counter, its screen lighting up with yet another call. This time, it was a reporter from a prominent news network, her voice chipper yet insistent as she pleaded for an interview. He let it ring out, the sound fading into the hum of the refrigerator. He wasn't ready yet. The storm raging inside him needed time to settle. Anger pulsed through his veins like wildfire, scorching every thought it touched. Humiliation weighed on his chest, a heavy stone that refused to budge. Sadness lingered in the corners of his mind, soft and aching, while disbelief gnawed at him, whispering that this couldn't be real. But beneath it all, a quiet resolve took root, steady and unshakable. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every soul who'd been crushed under the same unjust heel, every voice silenced by fear or force. Justice, he thought, wasn't a gift, it was a battle, and he was beginning to feel the call to fight. Across town, the police department squirmed under a spotlight it couldn't escape. The officer at the heart of the mess was Patricia Hayes, a woman who'd worn the badge for 6 years. Her name surfaced like a dark tide, pulling with it a trail of complaints, excessive force, sharp words laced with prejudice, incidents swept under the rug. Public records painted a picture of a woman who wielded her authority like a club, yet somehow kept her job. Now, with the world watching, the department scrambled to respond. They announced that Hayes had been sidelined, tucked away on administrative leave while they investigated. But the words rang hollow to a public already fed up. Outside the station, the air crackled with tension as protests swelled. People spilled into the streets, their signs bold and unyielding: enough is enough. Accountability now, their chants rising like a chorus of thunder. The videos of Nathaniel's encounter, raw and unfiltered, raced across the internet, racking up millions of views. Each share ignited furious debates about the deep-seated biases staining law enforcement, a wound too long ignored. Patricia Hayes, meanwhile, sat in her small apartment, blinds drawn tight against the chaos outside. She wasn't used to this, being the one under scrutiny. For years, she'd walked with the confidence of someone untouchable. her badge a shield against consequence. Now, that shield was cracking. She replayed the supermarket incident in her mind, her jaw tightening as she justified every step. He'd look suspicious, she told herself. She'd had to act. But doubt crept in, cold and unwelcome, whispering that maybe she'd gone too far. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some supportive, others distant, but the silence from her superiors stung most. She'd been a loyal officer, she thought bitterly, yet here she was, cast aside like a liability. The weight of her choices pressed down, and for the first time, she wondered if power had twisted her more than she'd realized. For days after the incident, the police chief stood before a sea of cameras, his tie slightly askew, sweat beading on his forehead. The press conference was a desperate attempt to quell the firestorm. He gripped the podium, his knuckles white, and read from a script that sounded rehearsed to death. "We take these allegations with the utmost seriousness," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "Officer Hayes's actions do not reflect the values we uphold. Effective immediately, she has been terminated." The crowd's reaction was a jagged mix. Some nodded in cautious approval. Others shouted that it was too little, too late. A young woman with a megaphone stepped forward during a live interview, her eyes blazing. "Firing one cop doesn't fix a system that's rotten to the core," she said, her words slicing through the noise. "This isn't justice, it's damage control." The lesson was clear. Power abused in the dark would eventually face the light. But the consequences had to reach deeper than one scapegoat. For Nathaniel, the decision to speak came after days of wrestling with himself. He chose a major news program, sitting under bright studio lights that made his palms sweat. The host leaned forward, her expression sympathetic yet probing, and Nathaniel took a breath. His voice was steady, carrying a quiet strength as he recounted the supermarket ordeal where his heart had pounded. The sting of being judged by the color of his skin, the fear that he might not walk away. "This isn't about me," he said, meeting her gaze. "It's about making sure no one else has to feel that terror, that shame. It's about holding people accountable, those with power most of all, and building a world where respect isn't a privilege, it's a right." His words hung in the air, heavy with purpose. The host nodded, visibly moved, but Nathaniel's mind was already elsewhere, plotting the next step in a fight he hadn't chosen, but couldn't abandon. The fallout rippled outward, unstoppable. News panels dissected the story night after night, pundits clashing over racial profiling and systemic failure. Social media buzzed like a hive, hashtags multiplying as activists seized the moment to spotlight the bias festering in law enforcement. Communities rallied, their voices blending into a nationwide demand for reform. Nathaniel found himself swept into a role he'd never imagined: a advocate, symbol, reluctant hero. Invitations flooded in. "Speak at this rally, join that panel." He didn't crave the attention, but he understood its weight. Partnering with local groups, he dug into the roots of the problem: poverty, mistrust, unchecked authority, determined to turn his pain into progress. His story became a beacon, a stark reminder that silence breeds decay, while accountability sparks change. Justice, he realized, wasn't just punishment, it was tearing down what was broken and building something better. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Nathaniel stood at the edge of a sprawling park, the sun warm on his shoulders. Hundreds had gathered, families with strollers, veterans in worn caps, activists with megaphones, ordinary folks clutching homemade signs. The crowd stretched across the grass, a tapestry of hope and anger. He stepped to the microphone, the wind tugging at his jacket, and began. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "What happened to me wasn't a fluke. It's a symptom of something massive, something wrong. But together, we can fix it. We can create a world where no one's targeted for their skin or their roots." Cheers erupted, a wave of sound that shook the air, but Nathaniel's face stayed grave. "This isn't just about pointing fingers at the guilty. It's about repairing systems that fail us. It's about teaching respect, understanding, and ensuring our kids grow up free from fear." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the sea of fascism, old, weary, fierce. "So what can you do? Call out wrong when you see it. Lift up those fighting for equality. And above all, treat each other with the dignity we're all owed." As the rally wound down, Nathaniel stepped away, the crowd's energy still humming in his bones. He felt lighter, as if the weight of that supermarket moment had shifted into something purposeful. The road ahead loomed long, and Ruff knew that, but he was ready, not just for himself, but for the countless others whose stories never made the headlines. That viral video, once a source of shame, had become a battle cry, a spark for justice and renewal. For Nathaniel, it was proof that even in the shadow of power's misuse, the fight for what's right could endure. The lesson echoed in every step he took. When authority oversteps, consequences must follow, not just for the individual, but for the systems that enable them. And in that fight, every voice mattered, every stand counted, every push forward built a future worth believing in.